Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to slumber. Tonight, we're travelling not to the edge of the universe, not into a black hole, and not into the strange inner workings of time itself, but to a quiet place in northern Japan where stones have been sitting in the grass for about 4,000 years, doing what stones do best, saying very little, and somehow making everyone else ask very large questions. Our journey takes us to the Ōyu Stone Circles in Kazuno City, Akita Prefecture, a prehistoric site from the late Jōmon period, set on a plateau near the Ōyu River, where two great stone circles called Manza and Nonakado still mark the ground. The official description of the site places it at around 2000 to 1500 BCE, on a plateau about 180 metres above sea level, close to rivers where salmon and trout once moved upstream and forests spread through the surrounding hills. Now, before we begin wandering among these stones, I'd love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Are you somewhere near a city street, with traffic sighing softly outside the window? Are you in a small town where the night arrives slowly? Are you listening from Japan, perhaps not terribly far from Akita itself, where the mountains and forests still hold traces of the world we're about to imagine? And if you happen to know, what time is it where you are right now? There is something quietly fitting about asking that before visiting a place built by people who watch the seasons, the sun, the returning fish, the growth of plants, and the movements of the year with far more patience than most of us bring to waiting for a kettle to boil. If you find this gentle expedition soothing, interesting, or simply a nice way to let the day loosen its grip a little, I'd be ever so grateful if you gave the video a like and perhaps subscribed. It helps this quiet corner of Earth reach other tired travellers who may also enjoy drifting off beside ancient places, old questions and stones that have been minding their own business since long before anyone invented the snooze button. So, settle in. Let your thoughts slow down and imagine a broad, open place in northern Honshu. Not the Japan of neon streets, railway platforms, vending machines, and perfectly timed announcements, but a much older Japan. A Japan of deep forests, cold rivers, damp earth, smoke from small fires, and people who knew their local landscape not as scenery, but as home, pantry, calendar, shelter, and story all at once. The Ōyu Stone Circles do not rise like a pyramid, or tower over the land like a castle, or gleam with gold like a royal tomb. They are low, patient, and almost modest at first glance. Stones arranged in rings, stones set in patterns. Stones placed carefully enough that thousands of years later we can still tell that someone meant something by them, and that is where the mystery begins. Because stones do not gather themselves into circles, they do not politely decide to form a monument. They do not roll across the land and say, "You know what this field needs? A bit of prehistoric geometry." Someone chose them, carried them, arranged them, returned to them, remembered them, and probably taught others why they mattered. The first thing to understand is that the people who made these circles were part of the Jōmon world, one of the longest-lasting prehistoric cultural traditions on Earth. The word Jōmon is often translated as a cord-marked, a name that comes from the patterns pressed into their pottery using cords, ropes, or twisted fibres. It is a simple name for a remarkably complex way of life. The Jōmon people were not farmers in the later rice field sense that many people associate with ancient Japan. They lived by hunting, fishing, gathering plants, collecting nuts, using forest resources and drawing food from rivers and coasts. Yet they also settled in communities, made pottery, built structures, developed rituals, created figurines, and shaped landscapes in ways that still puzzle and fascinate archaeologists. The wider World Heritage listing for the Jōmon prehistoric sites in northern Japan describes these sites as evidence of people who settled while living by gathering, fishing and hunting for more than 10,000 years, with a spiritual culture expressed through clay figurines and arranged stones. That combination can feel surprising if we're used to a neat little ladder of history, where first people wander, then they farm, then they settle, then they become complex. Real human history, as usual, refuses to behave quite so tidily. It spills over the edges, it drops crumbs on the carpet, it makes archaeologists sigh gently and sharpen their pencils. The Jōmon people show us that communities can become settled and symbolically rich without following exactly the same path as the early farming societies of Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, or the Indus Valley. They had their own timing, their own adaptations, and their own ways of making a meaningful life in a land of forests, rivers, coasts, snow, volcanoes, and seasonal abundance. At Ōyu, that life seems to have included not just daily survival, but large shared works that required planning, memory, cooperation, and a reason strong enough to move thousands of stones. And the stones really are the quiet centre of it all. The Ōyu site includes two major circles, the Manza Stone Circle and the Nonakado Stone Circle. According to the official Jōmon site information, Manza measures about 52 metres across, while Nonakado is about 44 metres across, and both are made from river stones of different sizes arranged in varied forms. Around them, archaeologists have found remains of pillar-supported buildings, storage pits, pit graves, and other features laid out in relation to the circles. Another local introduction notes that Manza consists of more than 100 stone arrangements, Nonakado about 60, with thousands of river stones used across the two circles. That is not the work of someone casually tidying up a field on a quiet afternoon. That is organised effort. That is community labour. That is someone saying, in whatever language was spoken there, "No, not that stone, the other one. Yes, the heavy one. Lovely, bring it over here." And perhaps someone else, 4,000 years ago, making the same face we make today when asked to help move furniture. It is easy to look at an archaeological site and forget that every object there once belonged to a world of bodies and weather. These stones were not always museum pieces or heritage markers. They were touched by hands, they were carried or dragged. They were set down in soil that could be wet, frozen, dusty, or thick with roots. People may have come to the circles in groups with children nearby, with elders watching, with dogs nosing at scraps, with smoke from fires moving low across the ground. A place like Ōyu asks us to think not only about design, but about effort. How many people did it take to move the stones? How long did the work continue? Was it done during a particular season, perhaps when food was more available and communities could gather? Were the circles built all at once or added to over time? Did each group know exactly what the finished place would look like, or did the monument grow gradually, like a shared memory gaining detail each time it was retold? The honest answer in many cases is that we do not know, and that is not a failure. It is part of the work. Archaeology is often less like opening a book and more like walking into a room after everyone has left, then trying to understand the conversation from the cups on the table, the position of the chairs, and one suspiciously important-looking spoon. At Ōyu, the evidence gives us patterns, stone arrangements, graves, buildings, ritual objects, alignments, pottery, traces of food and settlement nearby. But the voices are gone. No written explanation was left behind. No carved sign says, "Welcome to the Ōyu ceremonial and community gathering area. Please keep your sandals off the sacred stones." We have material clues, and from those clues, careful interpretations. The circles are thought to have served as special places for rituals and cemeteries, and official descriptions connect them to ceremonies, burials, and the spiritual life of communities in the late Jōmon period. That phrase, special places, is worth staying with for a moment. Every human society makes special places. Some are grand and formal, some are quiet and personal. A church, a shrine, a cemetery, a war memorial, a childhood tree, a kitchen table where the same family stories are told every winter. A place becomes special when people return to it, when memory gathers there, when ordinary ground is marked by repeated attention. The Ōyu Stone Circles seem to have been one of those places, but on a scale that reached beyond a single household. They may have drawn people from surrounding settlements. They may have helped smaller communities maintain bonds in a changing climate and shifting social landscape. The local site explanation suggests that the circles played a role in strengthening ties between villages during a period when climate cooling and smaller, more decentralized settlements were affecting life, with the site functioning as a kind of shared spiritual base for communal ceremonies and cemeteries. That is a very human idea. When life becomes uncertain, people gather. They make rituals, they mark the dead, they tell stories about where they came from and what they owe to the land around them. They create places that say, we are still here, we belong to one another, and this ground remembers us. The Jōmon people of Ōyu were not living in a world frozen in time, like figures in a diorama politely waiting for modern visitors. They were adapting, they were making choices, they were raising children, losing loved ones, watching seasons fail or flourish, finding food, negotiating with neighbouring groups, repairing tools, making pottery, and probably wondering, at least occasionally, why someone had misplaced the good stone scraper again. Their lives were not vague, they were specific, skilled, and practical. The mystery of the stone circles does not make those people less real. It makes us more aware of how much real life can vanish when writing is absent and only durable things remain. Still, some of the durable things are wonderfully revealing. At and around the circles, archaeologists have found objects that do not seem to belong only to everyday work. Official descriptions mention clay figurines, clay tablets, animal-shaped and bell-shaped clay objects, stone rods, and stone swords among the ritual tools unearthed around the stone circles. These objects matter because they suggest that Ōyu was not simply a place where people lived beside some useful stones. It was a place where symbolic actions took place. Clay figurines across the Jōmon world are often discussed in relation to ritual, healing, fertility, protection, or other spiritual practices, though their exact meanings can vary and remain debated. Clay tablets from Ōyu, including the well-known small tablets sometimes nicknamed Dobankun, show how even a small object can open large questions. The official site describes one clay tablet with puncture marks, representing parts of the human body, and numbers from 1 to 6. Imagine holding such an object in your palm. It is small enough to feel almost intimate, yet old enough to make your daily worries feel briefly rearranged. The site also has a relationship with the sun, though here we need to walk carefully and not sprint into fantasy, because ancient stones have a way of attracting dramatic claims, the way porch lights attract moths. The official description says that central stones in the circles are arranged in a straight line with sundial-like stonework, suggesting that people built the circles with attention to the movement of the sun. A line drawn between the centres of the stone circles points towards sunset on the summer solstice. That does not mean we should instantly imagine robed astronomer priests calculating eclipses with mysterious lost technology, while someone plays a very serious flute in the background. It does mean that the builders seem to have noticed the sky with care, and why wouldn't they? The sun was not an abstract object to them. It shaped warmth, plant growth, travel, animal behaviour, daylight, darkness, snowmelt, and the timing of seasonal tasks. To follow the sun was not a hobby. It was part of paying attention. 4,000 years ago, the world at Ōyu would have been full of seasonal signals, salmon and trout in the rivers, nuts ripening in the forest, snow arriving and retreating, birds moving, plants sprouting, flowering, fruiting, dying back. The year was not just a number. It was a sequence of practical changes that mattered to everyone. A community that lived by fishing, gathering and hunting needed memory systems. It needed ways of knowing when to gather, when to store, when to move, when to hold ceremonies, when to meet others, and when to prepare for hard months. A stone alignment toward the summer solstice sunset may have helped mark the year, or it may have carried symbolic meaning, or both. In many societies, the practical and the spiritual are not separate drawers in the cabinet. They are folded together. The calendar is also a ritual pattern. The returning fish are also a gift. The dead are not simply gone. They remain part of the social landscape, remembered in ceremonies, places and objects. That may be one reason the Ōyu Stone Circles feel so powerful even now. They bring together things that modern life often separates: the body and the landscape, the dead and the living, the sky and the ground, the practical and the ceremonial, a river that feeds you, a forest that shelters you, stones that mark a place where people return. Today, many of us experience time as something displayed on devices, divided into appointments, reminders, timers, and little alerts that somehow always arrive when we have just become comfortable. Time for the Jōmon people was not less precise simply because it was not digital. It was read differently. It was read in light, weather, plants, animal movement, stored food, the condition of paths, the behaviour of rivers, and perhaps the position of the sun over carefully arranged stones. In that sense, Ōyu is not only a place of stone, it is a place where people organised attention, and attention is one of the deepest forms of respect humans can give a landscape. To notice the exact return of a season, to know which stones came from which river, to remember where ancestors were buried, to teach children the meaning of a place, to gather with others year after year in the same open ground. All of this turns landscape into memory. It is easy, in a modern museum mood, to ask, what was this for? As if one answer should be enough. Was it a cemetery, a ritual site, a solar marker, a community meeting place, a monument? The answer may be yes in several directions at once. A modern cemetery can also be a garden, a place of history, a site of family gathering, a quiet walking path, and a reminder not to waste too much of one's life arguing with customer service chatbots. Human places often do more than one thing. Ancient places were no different. The landscape around Ōyu helps us slow down into that idea. The site lies in an inland area of northern Japan, not isolated from nature, but set within a system of river, forest, mountain views, and seasonal resources. The local site describes the surrounding scenery as including the Ōyu River near the plateau, deciduous broad-leaved forests, the Ōyu Mountains to the east, and the Takamori Mountains to the west. Stand there in imagination for a moment, not as a tourist rushing to take a photograph before lunch, but as someone arriving on foot in a world where distance has to be felt in the legs. The ground is uneven. The air smells of plants, smoke, wet stone and river water. Voices carry differently in open land. The circles are not ruins yet. They are active. People are gathering. Some have come from nearby settlements, some perhaps from farther away. Children recognise relatives they have not seen since the last gathering. Food is being prepared. Objects are brought out. Some stones are already in place. Others may be added. The dead are remembered. The sun lowers. The day cools. The place is doing what it was made to do. Of course, we should not pretend we can see it perfectly. We cannot. There is a difference between careful imagination and making things up with too much confidence. Nobody wants archaeology wearing a fake moustache and claiming to be certainty. But imagination, when held close to evidence, is useful. It helps us remember that archaeological sites were lived, not merely constructed. The stones at Ōyu are not just a pattern when viewed from above. They were part of events. Maybe people approached them from certain directions. Maybe some areas were restricted. Maybe certain objects were handled only by particular people. Maybe songs or spoken formulas accompanied ceremonies. Maybe silence mattered. Maybe there was grief, gratitude, feasting, negotiation, and ordinary social awkwardness. Because wherever humans gather, someone eventually has to stand around wondering whether they should help or whether that would make things worse. The opening question of this whole journey is simple, but it keeps widening. What was happening here 4,000 years ago? At first, the answer seems to be people were arranging stones. Then it becomes people were gathering for rituals and burials. Then it becomes communities were maintaining bonds, watching seasons, marking the sun, remembering the dead, and making a shared place in a landscape that supported them. And then, if we stay with it a little longer, the question becomes less distant. What was happening here was human life, not in a vague prehistoric fog, but in all its familiar seriousness. People were trying to live well. They were trying to understand change. They were trying to place themselves between river and forest, sky and soil, ancestors and children. They were doing what humans have always done, though with different tools and different words, making meaning out of the fact that we're alive for a while, in a place that outlasts us. That is why a circle is such a fitting shape to find here. Not because we need to make it mystical beyond evidence, but because circles are practical and social. A circle gathers attention toward a centre. A circle has no obvious front row. A circle can enclose, mark, separate, or bring together. When stones are placed in a circle, they change how people move and where people look. They create inside and outside. They make a piece of ground different from the ground around it. The Ōyu circles may have held graves, ceremonies, alignments, and community identity all at once. They were not simply decorations on the land. They were built forms that helped people act together. And acting together is one of the great forces of human history, whether the result is a stone circle, a cathedral, a village festival, or a group chat that somehow requires 86 messages to choose a restaurant. So tonight, as we begin, we are not trying to solve Ōyu all at once. That would be a bit like trying to understand an entire forest by interrogating one acorn. Instead, we're going to walk toward it slowly. We will begin with the world around the stones, the forests and rivers of northern Japan, the Jōmon way of life, the foods people relied on, the settlements they made, and the seasonal rhythms that shaped their days. Then the circles themselves will come into clearer view, not as isolated monuments, but as part of a living landscape. Because before we can ask why people built such a place, we need to understand the world that made such a place possible. A world of broad-leaved trees, cold water, returning fish, handmade pottery, smoke in the air, and communities whose traces still rest beneath the grass. To understand why people gathered stones at Ōyu, we have to slow down and look first at the world around those stones. Not the site as it looks today, with paths, signs, careful preservation, and visitors arriving with cameras and sensible shoes, but the older landscape beneath it. The Ōyu Stone Circles sit in what is now Kazuno City, in Akita Prefecture, on a plateau near the Ōyu River, a tributary of the Yonashiro River in northern Honshu. Official descriptions place the site at about 180 meters above sea level, close to rivers where salmon and trout could migrate upstream, with deciduous broad-leaved forests spreading through the surrounding hills. The stone circles themselves belong to the late Jōmon period, around 2000 to 1500 BCE, which means that when we say 4,000 years ago, we're stepping into a time long before written history in Japan, long before rice paddies became the familiar image of the countryside, long before samurai, emperors in recorded chronicles, temples with names we know, or anyone standing around wondering whether a train would arrive exactly on time. Imagine the land first. Northern Akita is not a flat and empty stage. It is shaped by valleys, mountains, rivers, seasonal cold, deep green growth, and long winters that do not politely leave just because one has grown tired of them. Around Ōyu, the wider landscape would have offered water, forest, stone, plants, animals, and seasonal routes of movement. The Ōyu Mountains rise to the east, other uplands and wooded areas stretch around, and the rivers run through the basin like slow instructions written into the ground. For the people who lived here, the river was not background scenery. It was a source of food, a route through the landscape, a marker of place, and probably a familiar sound in the daily mind. A river has its own calendar. It changes with snowmelt, rain, drought, fish runs, ice, and the soft thickening of summer banks. If you live close to a river long enough, you stop thinking of it as one thing. You know its moods. You know where it becomes shallow, where it can be crossed, where stones are easiest to gather, where fish may be trapped, where children should not play too carelessly, and where a person might sit for a while and pretend to be working while actually watching the water do the work instead. The official Ōyu descriptions emphasize that the site stood close to rivers and forests, and that setting is not a small detail. It is one of the reasons such a community could exist here at all. The people of this place belong to the Jōmon world, a long and varied cultural tradition across the Japanese archipelago. The wider Jōmon prehistoric sites in northern Japan are recognized as evidence of pre-agricultural yet sedentary communities, people who lived mainly by gathering, fishing and hunting, while also developing settled villages, ritual practices, pottery traditions, and complex relationships with their landscapes. UNESCO describes these northern sites as testimony to a sedentary hunter-fisher-gatherer society that developed over thousands of years in Northeast Asia, from around 13,000 BCE to 400 BCE. That phrase can sound a little formal, as official heritage language often does, like a museum label wearing a tie. But underneath it is a fascinating idea. These were not people merely wandering without structure until agriculture arrived to rescue them. They built lives with rhythm, storage, skill, memory, and social organization. They lived close to natural cycles, but not passively. They watched, collected, processed, preserved, returned, and adapted. For a long time, many people imagined prehistoric life in very simple terms. There were hunters and gatherers, then farmers, then towns, then states, then written history, as if the whole human past could be stacked like a neat set of bowls, useful perhaps in a school diagram, but not quite fair to the people who actually lived it. The Jōmon world complicates that tidy ladder. Many Jōmon communities were settled or semi-settled for long periods without depending on full-scale rice agriculture. They used pottery from very early times, built pit dwellings, stored food, made tools from stone, bone, antler, wood, and shell, kept dogs, created ornaments, and produced clay figurines and other objects connected to ritual life. They knew their local environments in ways that most modern people can barely imagine. Many of us can identify a low phone battery from across a room, but would struggle to name the edible plants growing beside the nearest footpath. The Jōmon people could not afford that sort of charming ignorance. Their knowledge was daily, practical, and shared across generations. Food is a good place to begin, because food makes ancient life less abstract. It brings people out of the mist and back into bodies. In the Jōmon period, people obtained food mainly through gathering, fishing, and hunting. Official Jōmon culture materials list mountain vegetables and nuts such as chestnuts, walnuts, and Japanese horse chestnuts as important foods, with chestnuts especially useful because they could be eaten without the bitter processing required by some other nuts, while horse chestnuts needed soaking and preparation to remove bitterness. Fishing tools such as hooks and harpoons were developed, and bows and arrows were used for hunting. This means the landscape around Ōyu was not just beautiful, it was busy with possibility. The forest held nuts, fruits, fibres, fuel, building material, animals, mushrooms, roots, vines and leaves. The rivers offered fish, water, stones, clay-rich banks, transport corridors, and seasonal signals. The open spaces near settlements allowed people to work, dry foods, repair tools, prepare hides, cook, gather, and talk, which is one of humanity's oldest and most renewable resources. Autumn would have been especially important. In a northern forest, autumn is not only a season of pretty leaves and people saying that the air feels crisp. It is a working season. Nuts ripen, fruits appear, fish runs may intensify. Animals change their patterns. Cold weather begins to announce itself with very little concern for whether anyone feels ready. Chestnuts, walnuts, acorns, and horse chestnuts could be gathered in quantity and stored or processed. Some nuts are generous and straightforward. Others, like horse chestnuts and many acorns, require knowledge, soaking, leaching, pounding, rinsing, drying, and patience. In other words, prehistoric food preparation was not simply grabbing whatever looked edible and hoping for the best. Hoping for the best is not a long-term nutritional strategy. It was technical work. It involved learned procedures, tools, containers, water access, timing, and probably a good deal of advice from older people who had seen mistakes made before and had no intention of watching the younger generation poison dinner out of enthusiasm. Pottery made a great difference in such a world. The Jōmon are famous for pottery, and not only because later archaeologists needed a convenient name. Pots allowed people to boil foods, cook stews, process nuts, render fats, store materials, and create new textures and meals. Boiling is an underrated revolution. It turns tough plants softer, extracts nutrition, makes some foods safer, and allows a household to combine ingredients that would otherwise be difficult to eat. A pot is not just a container. It is a small domestic technology for changing what a landscape can provide. Think of a cooking pot sitting near a hearth at Ōyu or at a nearby settlement. Steam rises, someone stirs, someone else brings more wood. A child asks whether it is ready. It is not ready. The child asks again anyway, because some human behaviours are older than stone circles. The pot contains more than food. It contains knowledge of season, plant, fire, water, and patience. The forests around northern Jōmon settlements were not simply wild supermarkets where people wandered casually with baskets. There is evidence in the wider Jōmon world that people managed or encouraged useful plant resources, especially nut trees such as chestnut in some areas. Official Jōmon culture materials note that plants were cultivated, and research summaries on Jōmon landscapes discuss the importance of chestnut, walnut, horse chestnut, and acorn gathering, with some sites showing signs that useful trees grew near villages and may have been protected or managed. This matters because it changes the way we imagine the relationship between people and forest. The people were not separate from nature, standing outside it like visitors at a scenic overlook. They were participants. They cut, gathered, burned, planted, selected, protected, cleared, and returned. Their activities shaped the environment, even without fields in the later agricultural sense. The forest gave to them, and they changed the forest in return. There is a quiet sophistication in that. Modern people often divide landscapes into categories: wild, farmed, urban, abandoned, preserved. But many ancient landscapes were lived in mosaics, shaped by repeated small actions over long periods. A path forms because people walk it. A grove becomes important because useful trees are spared. A riverside becomes a work area because water is needed for soaking nuts or cleaning fish. A patch of ground becomes a gathering place because it is flat, visible, remembered, and close enough to resources without being swallowed by them. Ōyu, on its plateau, was part of such a working mental map. People would have known not just where things were, but when they mattered. A tree is not the same tree in spring and autumn. A river is not the same river before and after rain. A hunting ground is not always equally useful. A stone suitable for building is not merely anywhere. It has to be found, selected, moved, and placed. The animals of the landscape were also part of this world. Deer, wild boar in many Jōmon regions, hares, birds, small mammals, fish, and shellfish, where available, all contributed to diets across the archipelago, though local availability varied. In northern inland Akita, rivers and forests would have mattered deeply. Official materials for the broader Jōmon culture mention bows and arrows for capturing game and fishing gear, such as hooks and harpoons for catching fish and shellfish. Hunting was not only a matter of strength or bravery, though people do enjoy making hunting stories sound dramatic, especially if nobody present can contradict them. It required tracking, timing, cooperation, knowledge of animal behaviour, tool maintenance, and careful use of the catch afterward. Meat, bone, antler, sinew, hide, fat, and teeth could all have uses. A successful hunt was not simply a meal. It was a material for tools, clothing, ornaments, stories, obligations, and perhaps ritual actions as well. Fishing, especially in rivers where salmon and trout migrated, added another rhythm to life. The official description of Ōyu highlights the nearby rivers where salmon and trout could be caught as food sources. Migrating fish are not available in the same way every day of the year. They arrive in season, and when they do, they can provide abundance that must be handled quickly. Fish can be eaten fresh, but also dried, smoked, stored, or shared. A salmon run can draw people together because the work is intense and the opportunity temporary. It is easy to imagine the river becoming a place of activity. People setting traps, using spears or hooks, cleaning fish, carrying them back, smoking or drying them, with dogs waiting nearby in a manner that suggests deep spiritual commitment but is actually mostly hope. Such seasonal abundance would have helped support settled life, and settled life in turn allowed people to build memory around particular places. The Jōmon communities of northern Japan lived through a climate and environment that changed across the long span of the period. By the late Jōmon, around the time of Ōyu, some areas saw shifts in settlement patterns and social organisation. The local Ōyu interpretation connects the stone circles to a period when cooling climate and the movement towards smaller, more dispersed settlements may have made shared ceremonial places important for maintaining ties among communities. That idea is worth handling gently, because ancient climate and social change are rarely as simple as one cause and one effect. But the general picture makes human sense. When resources, settlement sizes, or seasonal conditions shift, communities may need new ways to gather, exchange, marry, mourn, negotiate, and remember common identity. A stone circle can be a monument, but it can also be a meeting point. It can say, even if no words survive, this is where we come together. Daily life around Ōyu would not have been one long ceremony. That is an easy mistake to make when we focus on monuments. People did not wake every morning, gaze meaningfully at the horizon, and discuss cosmic alignments until bedtime. Someone had to gather fuel. Someone had to mend tools. Someone had to cook, carry, scrape, weave, clean, watch children, repair structures, prepare food, and deal with all the small inconveniences that make humans human. A roof leaks, a basket breaks, a child drops something important into mud. A dog steals food with the confidence of a creature that knows very well it is loved. Ancient life was not only sacred and symbolic, it was also repetitive, practical, skilled, and often probably tiring. That ordinary work is not separate from the great stone circles. It is what made them possible. No monument rises from a society that does not first know how to feed itself, organise labour, and pass knowledge from one generation to the next. The homes of Jōmon people were often pit dwellings, structures partly dug into the ground, with posts supporting a roof. Such dwellings helped create stable living spaces in seasonal climates. Around the broader Ōyu site, remains connected with settlement activity and ritual activity have been found, including structures and pits, though the stone circles themselves appear to have had a special role rather than being simple residential features. A pit dwelling is a good reminder that warmth matters, sleep matters, shelter matters. In winter, northern Honshu can be cold and snowy. A community living there needed not only food, but stored food, dry fuel, clothing, tools, and social cooperation. The image of prehistoric people as constantly roaming in hardship misses the steadier truth. Survival depended on preparation. Winter is very persuasive that way. It does not care whether you had a busy autumn. It arrives, looks at your storage pits and firewood, and asks what exactly your plan is. In such a landscape, storage was a form of time travel. Not the thrilling science fiction kind with flashing lights and a nervous person saying, "This might be dangerous," but the everyday kind. To store nuts in autumn is to send food forward into winter. To dry fish is to move a river's abundance into a future cold day. To maintain tools is to prepare for work not yet done. To teach a child where edible plants grow is to send knowledge into years you may not live to see. The Jōmon world was built on these forward-looking habits. People who depend on seasonal resources must think beyond the present moment. They must remember last year, anticipate next year, and act at the right time. Time for them was not an abstract schedule. It was built into food, weather, bodies, and places. That is one reason the later stone circles fit so naturally into this world. A community already used to seasonal return, stored memory and repeated gathering would understand the power of a place marked for return. The circles did not appear in a landscape of strangers passing randomly through. They belonged to people who knew the land in repeated cycles. The same river, but not the same water. The same trees, but not the same leaves. The same plateau, but different gatherings, different children, different dead. Over years and generations, a place can accumulate meaning the way a path accumulates firmness. Each visit adds something. Each ceremony, burial, meal, repair and story presses memory into the ground. By the time stones are arranged in circles, the landscape may already be full of older significance. We should also remember that Akita 4,000 years ago was part of a larger networked world, even if not a world of written borders and official maps. Jōmon communities across northern Japan shared broad traditions, but they were not all identical. Materials, styles, tools, and practices moved in different ways. People exchanged goods, married beyond their immediate group, visited other settlements, and carried ideas with them. Obsidian, jade, asphalt, shell ornaments, and other materials in the wider Jōmon world show that movement and exchange linked communities across distances. Ōyu was not an isolated dot. It was one place within a broader northern Jōmon landscape that included other settlements, ritual sites, rivers, forests, and routes of contact. UNESCO's listing includes 17 archaeological sites across Hokkaido, Aomori, Iwate, and Akita, representing different stages and settings of this long pre-agricultural culture. The people at Ōyu may not have known the full map we know now, but they knew connections. They knew neighbours. They knew where people came from. It's tempting to ask what they called themselves. Not Jōmon, certainly. That name came much later from the cord-marked pottery. They had their own words, their own names for rivers, animals, seasons, kin, tools, stories, and perhaps the place we now call Ōyu. Those words are gone. This can make the past feel distant, but it should also make us careful. When a people's language is lost, it is easy for modern labels to become too strong. We say Jōmon as if it names one simple thing, but it covers thousands of years and many regions. We say hunter-gatherer, but that can sound smaller than the life it describes. We say prehistoric, but that only means before written records, not before thought, culture, planning, humour, grief, or intelligence. The people of Ōyu were not waiting for history to begin. They were living history that simply did not write itself down. Their world was rich in texture. Think of the sounds: stone striking stone, a cord pressed into wet clay, firewood splitting, water moving over river stones, footsteps on leaves, voices at dusk. Dogs barking at something they probably considered very important. Think of the smells: smoke, wet earth, fish, nuts roasting or boiling, fresh cut wood, damp hides, crushed plants, snow in the air. Think of the colours: the dark green of summer forest, the yellow and red of autumn leaves, the pale brown of dried grass, blackened hearth soil, grey river stones, the orange interior of fire, the white of winter fields. Archaeology gives us objects, but those objects once existed in a full sensory world. A pot was not just a pot. It was warm from use, heavy when full, smoky near the hearth, rough or smooth under the fingers. A stone was not just a stone. It had weight, temperature, shape, and perhaps a known origin. The people who built the Ōyu Stone Circles selected river stones, many of them gathered from nearby waterways, and carried them to the plateau to form planned arrangements. The local site explains that the stones were taken from the river area and arranged into many groups within the two large circles. That act connects the river to the monument in a very physical way. The river provided not only fish and water, but also the stones that would become part of the ceremonial landscape. A stone taken from a river is already shaped by movement. Water has smoothed it, rolled it, worn it down, made it suitable for carrying or setting. Then human hands gave it a second life on land. The result is not just a circle made of rocks, it is a river translated into a gathering place, not in a mystical or exaggerated way, but in a practical one. The material of the monument came from the same landscape that sustained the people. There is something deeply grounded about that. The Ōyu circles were not made from exotic imported marble or distant quarried blocks meant to impress strangers. They were made from the familiar geology of the local world. Their power, if we can use that word carefully, came from arrangement, repetition, labour, and meaning, not from height or luxury. They belonged to a society where the boundary between practical and ceremonial life may have been more flexible than ours. A river stone could be a tool, a marker, a building material, or part of a ritual structure depending on how it was chosen and used. A place for the dead could also be a place for the living to meet. A seasonal gathering could also reinforce social bonds. A food-rich landscape could also be spiritually charged. Modern categories like economy, religion, architecture, and environment help us analyse the past, but ancient people did not necessarily file their lives into those folders. By now, the picture of Akita 4,000 years ago begins to feel less empty. We can see a forested river landscape supporting communities who are skilled in gathering, fishing, hunting, processing, storage, pottery making, tool use, and seasonal planning. We can see people living not as isolated families, but as members of wider networks with shared practices and ceremonial places. We can see why a plateau near rivers and forests might become important. It was near resources, visible within the landscape, and suitable for gatherings. It stood between the practical world of food and the social world of ceremony. It allowed people to come together in a place that could hold memory. And still, the stones wait just ahead of us. Because once we have the forest, the rivers, the seasonal work, and the Jōmon way of life in view, the circles themselves begin to look different. They are no longer strange objects dropped into a blank prehistoric field. They are the result of a whole way of living. They belong to people who knew how to read water and trees, who stored autumn for winter, who watched fish return, who shaped clay with practiced hands, who built homes against the cold, who moved through a landscape full of names we no longer know. The Manza and Nonakado circles, those two great arrangements of stone, were made from this world, and to walk toward them properly we should carry that world with us. The smell of smoke, the sound of the river, the work of gathering food, the cold edge of northern seasons, and the steady human need to meet, remember, and place meaning on the ground. The more we let the forest and river settle into view, the less the Ōyu Stone Circles feel like a puzzle dropped from the sky, and the more they begin to feel like something grown from the habits of a place. The people who gathered here were living in a landscape where everything useful had a season, a location, a method, and a memory attached to it. Food had to be found, carried, prepared, stored, shared, and understood. Rivers had to be watched. Weather had to be read. Trees had to be known not only by shape, but by what they offered and when. In such a world, a circle of stones was not just an arrangement. It was a decision made visible on the ground. And at Ōyu, the decision was made twice, in two great rings that still give the site its quiet power. Manza and Nonakado. These two stone circles are the main features of the site, with Manza measuring about 52 metres across and Nonakado about 44 metres across, each made from river stones arranged in different forms. At first, numbers can make a place feel smaller, as if saying 52 metres somehow explains the experience of standing near Manza. It does not really. 52 metres is larger than it sounds when you imagine it on the ground. It is not a small garden feature or a ring of stones someone could step around in a few seconds while wondering what to have for lunch. It is wide enough to hold a gathering, wide enough for people to move through and around, wide enough to shape how the eye travels across the plateau. Non-Akado, a little smaller but still impressive, stands as a partner rather than a footnote. Together they make Ōyu feel less like a single monument and more like a planned ceremonial landscape. One circle might be striking. 2 circles invite comparison. They ask why this place needed both. They ask whether different groups used them, whether they were built at different moments, whether each had a distinct role, or whether their pairing was part of the meaning from the start. The stones do not answer directly, which is frankly very typical of stones, but their arrangement keeps the question alive. The names themselves, Manza and Non-Akado, belong to the later history of the place, not to the language of the people who built it. The original names, if the circles had names, are gone. That is one of the small sadnesses of prehistory. We inherit the stones, but not the voices that first explained them. Still, the names we use today help us find our way. Manza is the larger of the two, and is described by the official local site as containing more than 100 stone arrangements. Non-Akado contains about 60. These are not simply 2 smooth rings like bracelets laid on the grass. They are made up of many smaller stone settings, using large and small river stones placed in round, oval, diamond, circular and square groupings. The local Ōyu site states that about 6,500 river stones were used in Manza and about 2,200 in Non-Akado. That detail changes everything. It means we should not imagine a quick outline made in a single afternoon. We should imagine repeated labour, sorting, carrying, choosing, placing and probably adjusting. Anyone who has ever tried to move one stubborn garden stone knows that stones are not famous for their cooperation. Now imagine thousands of them. There is something very grounded about the way these circles were made. Many famous stone monuments around the world rise upward, with massive standing stones that seem to challenge the sky. Ōyu is different. Its stones are mostly arranged low, close to the earth, set into patterns that spread across the ground rather than towering above it. The effect is not a shout. It is more like a steady statement. You have to look carefully. You have to notice the smaller arrangements within the larger form. The circles are not only about outline, but about internal structure. There are clusters, groupings, and repeated shapes. Some arrangements are thought to have been connected with graves, especially circular and square clusters made of more than 10 stones. So when we look at the circles, we may be looking not just at a monument, but at a place where the dead were included in the organisation of the living landscape. That is a different kind of architecture. It does not simply occupy space. It holds relationships. Try to imagine walking toward Manza 4,000 years ago. Not as a modern visitor crossing a preserved site, but as someone who already knows the place. The grass underfoot is not museum grass. The plateau is active. People have been here before you. Some stones are already set. Others may have been added recently or long ago. The circle does not appear suddenly like a wall. It gathers gradually in your view. First a few stones, then a pattern, then the sense of a wider ring. The eye starts to follow it. People may be moving around it, standing near particular settings, preparing for a ceremony, carrying food or speaking quietly. Some areas may be familiar and open, others perhaps treated with care or restriction. The circle changes how bodies behave. People do not walk through a marked sacred or funerary space in quite the same way they cross an ordinary patch of ground. Even if no fence stands there, the mind supplies one. The stones tell people where to slow down. Non-Akado, though smaller, would have had its own presence. It is easy to let the larger circle dominate our attention, because humans are easily impressed by size. We do the same with cakes, mountains, and sometimes dogs, but smaller does not mean less meaningful. Non-Akado's roughly 44-metre circle, with about 60 stone arrangements, would still have required considerable work and shared understanding. Its relationship with Manza is part of what makes Ōyu so interesting. Two circles in the same landscape can create a kind of dialogue. People moving between them may have experienced the site as a sequence rather than a single point. Perhaps one space was used for certain rites and the other for different ones. Perhaps they belonged to different communities who gathered at the same ceremonial centre. Perhaps one came first, and the other extended or renewed the significance of the place. These possibilities are not facts, and we should not dress them up as if they were, but they are the kinds of questions the layout encourages. What is clear is that both circles were built with careful attention to form. The stones were not scattered randomly. They were arranged in combinations of larger and smaller river stones, forming repeated patterns. Some are rounded, some elongated, some set upright, or placed with other stones radiating around them. Each small setting contributes to the larger ring, and the larger ring gives context to each small setting. This is one of the things that makes the site so rewarding to think about slowly. From far away, you see circles. Closer in, you see many individual arrangements. Closer still, you see stones chosen one by one. A monument can be understood at several scales. There is the full landscape scale, where Mansa and Nonacado sit near rivers and mountains. There is the circle scale, where each ring defines a broad area. There is the setting scale, where groups of stones form shapes. Then there is the hand scale, where someone once held or guided an individual stone into place. Archaeology often works that way, moving between the enormous and the intimate, until both begin to belong to the same story. The stones themselves came from rivers, which matters more than it may first seem. River stones have already been shaped by movement. Water turns sharp edges into smoother surfaces over time, rolling stones against stones, carrying them through channels, sorting them by size and weight. A river stone has a history before a human picks it up. It has travelled, or at least been worn by travel. When Jōmon people brought those stones to the plateau, they were moving pieces of the river into a ceremonial place. This does not require us to invent a hidden meaning. The practical meaning is already strong enough. The river provided material that was available, durable and familiar. But because the river also provided food and helped define the landscape, the use of river stones linked the monument physically to the waters that sustained local life. The circles were not made from anonymous material. They were made from the same world people walked through, fished from, drank from and crossed. The work of moving these stones would have been social. A single person might carry a small stone, perhaps with little trouble. Larger stones would require more effort, possibly several people, a sling, a wooden frame, dragging, rolling, or some other practical method that left no polite instruction manual for us to find. But even if we do not know the exact technique used for every stone, the scale tells us that cooperation mattered. Thousands of stones do not arrive by accident. They arrive because people agree, or are instructed, or are expected to help. That agreement itself is important. A community willing to build a place like Ōyu must have shared enough belief, obligation, or social structure to make the work worthwhile. The stones are not only archaeological objects, they are evidence of coordination. Someone remembered the plan. Someone knew where stones should go. Someone taught others the forms. Someone kept the work going beyond the first burst of enthusiasm, which, as anyone who has begun a home improvement project can confirm, is often the easy part. It is tempting to imagine a central designer, a prehistoric architect standing on the plateau, squinting thoughtfully and saying, "A little more to the left." Maybe there were people with special knowledge of the layout. Maybe certain elders, ritual specialists, or experienced builders guided the work. But the circles also may have developed over time through repeated ceremonies and additions. Large ritual landscapes are often accumulations as much as designs. A place gains shape because people return to it, add to it, repair it, and remember earlier actions. At Ōyu, some stone settings may have marked individual burials or specific events, while the larger circular plan tied them together. This would make the circles less like a single construction project, and more like a long conversation between generations. Each new setting could refer to the older ones, adding another point to a pattern already understood by the community. That possibility gives the site a different feeling. Instead of imagining the circles as finished monuments unveiled on a particular day, we can imagine them as places that grew, not randomly, but through ritual repetition. A grave is made, stones are placed, a ceremony is held, years pass. Another grave, another set of stones, another gathering. Children who once watched from the edge become adults, who know where to stand and what to bring. Elders who once guided ceremonies become ancestors remembered within the same space. The circle becomes denser with memory. By the time archaeologists encounter it thousands of years later, they see a pattern of stones. But for the people who made it, the pattern may have held names, kinship ties, seasonal events, grief, obligation, and stories. The stones are the surviving skeleton of a social memory whose living body has disappeared. The central areas of the circles are also important. Both Mansa and Nonakado include what are often called sundial-like stone arrangements. These arrangements involve elongated stones and surrounding stones set in patterns that suggest attention to the sun. Official and local descriptions state that each circle has a sundial-like stonework related to the centre, and that the line connecting the centres of the two circles and these stoneworks points toward the sunset at the summer solstice. This is one of those facts that immediately wakes up the imagination. The summer solstice is the longest day of the year. In a society deeply attentive to seasonal change, such a moment could have been practical, ceremonial, or both. Marking the sun's movement could help organise seasonal gatherings. It could also connect the circles to ideas about renewal, time, death, or the relationship between people and the sky. We do not need to claim more certainty than the evidence allows. The alignment itself is meaningful enough. Standing in such a circle at sunset would have been a bodily experience, not an abstract diagram. The air cools, shadows lengthen, people know the direction to watch. A stone arrangement points, or frames, or reminds. The sun lowers toward the horizon. On the solstice, it sets in the expected direction. There may be speaking, silence, offerings, movement, or simply shared attention. Modern people can look up a solstice on a calendar in less than 5 seconds, provided the internet is behaving and nobody has forgotten the Wi-Fi password. 4,000 years ago, knowledge of the solstice came from patient observation. It came from watching where the sun rose and set across the year, remembering, comparing, and marking. Stone makes that memory durable. A stone alignment is a way of asking the ground to help remember the sky. Yet the circles were probably not only solar markers. That would make them too narrow. The funerary interpretation is central. The site is thought to have been a place for rituals and cemeteries, and the smaller stone groupings are believed to have marked graves. If we bring the dead back into the picture, the solstice alignment becomes part of a richer whole. The movement of the sun, the turning of the year, the memory of ancestors, and the gathering of living communities may all have met here. A cemetery is not only a place where bodies are placed, it is a place where the living renegotiate their relationship with the dead. A ritual space is not only about belief, it is about gathering people into shared action. A solar marker is not only about astronomy. It is about time made visible. At Ōyu, these roles may have overlapped, and the overlap is exactly what makes the site feel so human. The two-circle layout might also reflect the structure of the communities that use the site. Archaeologists often consider whether large ceremonial places served multiple settlements rather than a single village. If smaller groups lived across the surrounding region, a shared monument could help maintain wider ties. People could gather for rituals, exchange information, find marriage partners, settle disputes, share food, and reinforce a sense of belonging. A stone circle does not have to function like a town hall to serve social purposes. The act of gathering itself does social work. People see who is present, who has grown older, who has had children, who is missing, who brings what, who stands where. In the absence of written records, repeated meetings are a powerful way to keep relationships alive. The circles may have been sacred, but sacred places are rarely separate from social life. They're often where social life becomes most visible. The relationship between Manza and Nonakado may have helped organize such gatherings physically. A large open ceremonial landscape gives people places to approach, pause, circulate, and assemble. The two circles may have allowed movement between spaces, perhaps marking stages in a rite or differences between groups. We should not invent a script for ceremonies we cannot know, but we can say that architecture shapes behaviour. Even low stones do that. A person entering a circle becomes aware of being inside. A person standing outside sees the ring as a boundary. A person moving from one circle to the other experiences distance, direction, and sequence. The sight teaches the body how to move through meaning, even if the words once spoken there are gone. One of the most interesting things about Ōyu is that the circles are monumental without being monumental in the usual way. They are not meant to overwhelm with height. They do not announce a ruler. They do not display carved battles, named kings, or captured enemies. There is no giant face staring across the valley, which depending on one's mood may be either a disappointment or a relief. Instead, the monumentality lies in pattern, labour, repetition, and endurance. Thousands of stones, arranged with care, spread across the ground. The circles ask for attention rather than submission. They feel communal rather than imperial. That fits what we know of the Jōmon world, where complex ritual and social life developed without the same signs of centralized states that appear in some other ancient civilizations. Ōyu's scale is impressive, but it does not feel like a palace. It feels like a place people made together because returning there mattered. The preservation of these patterns into the present is itself remarkable. Many ancient sites are lost to farming, building, erosion, roadwork, collecting, or simple lack of recognition. Ōyu was recognized and studied in the modern period, and today it is part of the UNESCO-listed Jōmon prehistoric sites in northern Japan. The UNESCO listing includes sites across Hokkaido, Aomori, Iwate, and Akita that together show the development of Jōmon settlement, subsistence, and spiritual culture over a very long span. But before it was heritage, before it was interpreted for visitors, before anyone described it in official language, Ōyu was local ground. Its stones were there under weather, grass, snow, and memory. Their survival allows us to stand in relation to decisions made 4,000 years ago. That is no small thing. Most human actions vanish almost instantly. A conversation disappears as soon as it is spoken. A meal is eaten. A footprint fills with water. But some actions, if made in stone, in the right place, under the right conditions, can wait quietly for thousands of years to be noticed again. Looking closely at the smaller arrangements within the circles helps bring the builders nearer. Some stones are grouped in compact forms, others create longer shapes or radiating patterns. These patterns required visual judgment. The people placing them had to understand not only where an individual stone belonged, but how it related to the stones around it. That suggests a shared visual language. Perhaps certain forms corresponded to certain rites, graves, families, statuses, or stages of ceremony. Perhaps some shapes had meanings we would not guess. One of the difficult truths of archaeology is that pattern does not automatically reveal intention. A stone setting may look like a symbol to us, and may have been something else entirely. Or it may have been deeply symbolic in a way no modern category captures. So the best approach is neither to flatten it into mere function, nor to float away into fantasy. We stay close to the evidence and admit that ancient meaning can be both structured and partly unreachable. The scale of Manza especially encourages us to think about visibility. A 52-metre circle is large enough that its full shape may be easier to grasp from a slightly raised position, or through repeated familiarity, than from standing within it at ground level. The builders likely did not need an overhead view to make it. human beings can create large shapes through measurement, pacing, sight lines, posts, chords, and shared knowledge. Still, the experience of being inside the circle would differ from the experience of seeing its plan. Inside, you might not perceive the perfect whole at once. You would see nearby stones, people, the central arrangement, and the line of the horizon. The circle would be felt as much as seen. That is important because prehistoric monuments were not built for aerial photographs, even though modern books do love a good aerial photograph. They were built for people moving at human height. Non-Ocado, too, would have its own internal experience. Smaller does not mean intimate in a household sense, but it may have felt more contained. With fewer stone settings, the arrangement could have been easier to take in, or perhaps it carried a different visual rhythm. The local description notes that the two circles use various stone arrangements combining large and small river stones into several shapes, and both include sundial-like stonework. The repetition between the circles suggests shared principles. The differences suggest particular histories. If one were simply a copy of the other, we might expect closer similarity. Instead, the two circles seem like relatives, not twins. They belong to the same tradition, but each has its own scale and density. That makes the site feel lived in over time, shaped by practice rather than stamped from a template. Around the circles, archaeologists have also found remains of buildings, storage pits, pit graves, and other associated features, indicating that the circles were part of a wider archaeological landscape rather than isolated rings. This surrounding context matters because it reminds us that ceremonial places need support. People gathering for rituals need places to prepare, store, meet, or shelter. They bring food and objects. They may stay for a time. They may build temporary or more lasting structures. A circle alone is striking, but a circle within a network of features tells us more about how the place functioned. Ōyu was not merely looked at, it was used. People came there and did things. The stones were central, but the life of the site extended beyond them. One can imagine the approach to a gathering. People arrive from nearby settlements, perhaps at a known time of year. Some carry baskets, tools, food, ornaments, pottery, or ritual objects. Others bring stones, or help prepare a grave, or tend fires. The two circles provide structure to the gathering. There may be movement from the edge inward, from one circle to another, from ordinary ground to marked ground. The central sundial-like arrangements stand as fixed points. The stone clusters mark places of memory. People recognize the arrangements connected with their own dead or their own group. Children are told not to step there, then immediately ask why, because curiosity is not a modern invention. Older people explain, perhaps patiently, perhaps for the 7th time that morning. This is how places teach, not through signs, but through repeated instruction, gesture, and correction. The idea of graves within or connected to stone arrangements brings a quiet seriousness to the site. We should not treat the circles only as mysterious geometry. If they were tied to burial, then grief was part of their making. Not grief in the abstract, but specific grief for specific people. Someone died. Others prepared the body, marked the place, gathered stones, performed actions, remembered. Over generations, those acts accumulated. The circle became not only a design, but a community of the dead. That does not make the site gloomy. Many societies treat ancestors as continuing presences, sources of identity, protection, obligation, or connection. A cemetery can be sorrowful and socially vital at the same time. It can be a place of loss, but also continuity. Ōyu may have helped the living stay connected to those who had gone before, while also reinforcing ties among those still walking the plateau. At the same time, the solar alignment reminds us that these rites may have been connected to cycles rather than endings alone. The summer solstice is not an ending, it is a turning point. After the longest day, the year begins gradually to tilt towards shorter light. A community attentive to such turning points might connect them with ideas of renewal, transition, or the ordering of social time. Again, we cannot write their beliefs for them, but we can understand why the sun's path mattered. In the north, seasonal change is not subtle. Light, temperature, food availability, snow, river conditions and plant growth all depend on the turning year. To align a ceremonial landscape with the sun is to place human memory within a wider natural rhythm. The dead rest within a world that continues to turn. The living gather as the year turns with it. This is where Manza and Nonakado begin to feel less like objects and more like instruments. Not instruments that make music exactly, though perhaps sound was part of ceremonies, but instruments for organising attention. They direct the eye towards centres, towards stone groupings, toward the horizon. They direct movement around marked spaces. They direct memory toward the dead and time toward the sun. They help a community do something together. That is what good ritual architecture does. It does not need to explain itself in words. It creates conditions where people know how to act, where meaning is held in movement, arrangement, and repetition. The stones are quiet now because the people are gone, but when the site was active, the stones may have been surrounded by voices, footsteps, smoke, food, mourning, teaching, and the ordinary rustle of people trying to stand in the right place without looking confused. It is also worth noticing how different Ōyu feels from many modern ideas of ancient mystery. We often want a single hidden secret. We want the one answer. Was it a calendar, a cemetery, a ritual centre, a meeting place, a map, a symbol? This desire for one answer is understandable. It is tidy. It makes a good headline. But ancient places rarely cooperate with headline thinking. Manza and Nonakado may have been many things at once. A place can mark time and hold graves. It can gather communities and honour ancestors. It can be practical in its seasonal timing and spiritual in its ceremonies. It can be built from local stone and still express ideas that reach beyond daily work. Human life does not separate neatly. So why should human monuments? The two circles at Ōyu ask us to imagine a society capable of long-term shared attention. That may be the most important point. A group of people decided that this plateau should be marked. They returned to it. They brought stones from rivers. They placed them in patterns. They buried or honoured the dead. They watched the sun. They built a landscape that carried meaning beyond one meal, one winter, one household, or one generation. That is not a small achievement. It is not less impressive because the stones lie low. If anything, their quietness makes the achievement more intimate. You do not have to shout across 4,000 years to be heard. Sometimes you only have to place a stone carefully enough that someone much later stops, looks down, and wonders who you were. And now that we have walked around the two great circles in our minds, seeing Manza with its broad ring and dense arrangements, Nonakado with its smaller but equally deliberate form, the river stones, the central alignments, the possible graves, and the community effort held in every pattern, another question rises naturally from the ground. How did all of this work actually happen? Not just why, but how? How were the stones chosen? How were they moved from river to plateau? How did people decide which shape belonged where? What kind of labour does a sacred place require before it becomes sacred? The circles give us the shape of the answer, but the stones themselves, their weight, their origin, their placement, and the hands that carried them bring us closer to the work behind the wonder. By the time a stone became part of Ōyu, it had already lived a very long life of its own. That may sound a little generous for an object with no pulse, no appetite, and no opinion about the weather. But river stones are not born smooth. They are broken from larger rock, shifted by water, knocked against other stones, rolled through current, pressed by ice, buried, uncovered, and worn slowly into shapes that fit the human hand better than jagged rock ever could. Long before anyone placed them in the circles at Manza or Nonakado, those stones had been shaped by the river. Water had done the first work. Human hands did the second. And somewhere in that meeting between current and community, a sacred place began to take form. The two great circles at Ōyu were made from river stones of different sizes, arranged in many patterns rather than simply laid as plain outlines. The Manza circle used about 6,500 river stones and contains more than 100 stone arrangements, while Nonakado used about 2,200 stones and contains about 60 arrangements. The stones form shapes such as round, oval, diamond, circular and square groupings, and some of the circular and square clusters are thought to have marked graves. That means the work was not just large in scale, it was detailed. Thousands of separate pieces had to be gathered, moved, sorted, understood, and set into place. A circle like this is not one action. It is many small actions repeated until the ground itself begins to carry meaning. The river mattered from the beginning. In a northern Jōmon landscape, a river was not just a line of water running past the edge of human life. It was food, movement, sound, boundary, tool source, and seasonal calendar. Fish moved through it. Stones rested in it. People crossed it, followed it, worked beside it, and learned its changing behaviour. A river could swell after rain, shrink in dry weather, freeze at the edges, carry leaves, bring fish upstream, expose gravel bars, and hide or reveal the materials people needed. If the stones at Ōyu were taken from riverbeds or riverbanks, then the builders were not using distant, unfamiliar material. They were bringing part of their everyday world into a special arrangement. It was local stone, familiar stone, stone shaped by the same water that supported daily life. In that sense, the circles were not separate from the landscape. They were the landscape reorganized by human intention. Imagine the first stage of that work, not the circle completed, not the wide pattern visible from a modern diagram, but a group of people by the river choosing stones. Some stones are too large, some are too small, some are the wrong shape. Some are useful for one kind of arrangement, others for another. A flat stone might sit well in a base. A longer stone might point, divide, frame, or stand out. Rounded stones might help form an edge. Smaller ones could fill spaces or create repeated patterns. The choosing itself required judgment. It was not simply a matter of scooping up whatever happened to be nearby. Anyone who has ever searched a beach for one good skipping stone knows that human beings can become surprisingly selective when staring at rocks. Now imagine that selectiveness applied not to a lazy afternoon by the water, but to a community project connected with graves, ceremonies, and the remembered order of a place. The stones then had to be moved. This is where the monument becomes physical in a way that numbers can only partly express. A single small stone can be carried in one hand. A larger one might need both arms, a basket, a sling, a wooden frame, or several people. Some stones in Japanese stone circles can range from a few kilograms to more than 100 kilograms, and although the exact weight of every stone at Ōyu varies, the total labour represented by thousands of stones is unmistakable. The builders did not have carts with rubber tyres, metal wheelbarrows, paved roads, or someone named Gary reversing a pickup truck while shouting that it was fine. Absolutely fine. They had bodies, wood, rope or cordage, practical knowledge and cooperation. They may have used poles, sledges, carrying frames, rolled stones, dragged them, or passed them hand to hand depending on size and terrain. The exact methods are not written down, but the result tells us that they knew how to solve the problem, and it was a real problem. Moving heavy objects across uneven ground is not only about strength, it is about timing, coordination, and patience. A person carrying a stone has to place each foot carefully. A group dragging a stone has to pull together. If the ground is wet, the work changes. If it is frozen, the work changes again. If the route goes uphill from the river to the plateau, the work becomes harder. A stone that seems manageable at the riverbank may become much less charming halfway up a slope. When arms ache, the ground is slippery, and someone has just remembered that they also have to help prepare food later. Monument building is often described in grand terms, but it is made of tired muscles. It is made of repeated effort. It is made of people doing one difficult thing, then doing it again. That effort tells us something important about the site. People do not move thousands of stones without a reason strong enough to justify the work. A single family might build a hearth, repair a dwelling, dig a storage pit, or place a marker. But the Ōyu circles required more than a household's convenience. They suggest shared purpose. Perhaps many people from nearby settlements contributed labour. Perhaps certain groups were responsible for certain arrangements. Perhaps the work took place during gatherings when enough people were present, possibly after seasonal food had been collected, or when river resources were abundant enough to support a larger meeting. We cannot know every detail, but we can say this. The circles were made by cooperation. Every stone is evidence that someone participated in a collective act. The plateau itself also had to be made ready. The Ōyu site lies on a plateau near the Ōyu River, and official descriptions note that the circles were built on that open elevated ground, with manza and nonakado forming the main stone arrangements of the site. A plateau is useful because it gives space, visibility, and a sense of separation from lower riverbanks or denser working areas. But an open place still requires preparation. Vegetation may have been cleared. The ground may have been levelled or maintained. Paths may have formed through repeated use. Areas for movement, gathering, burial, and ceremony had to remain recognisable. Even if the stones were low to the ground, the site itself had to be cared for. Sacred places do not stay readable on their own. Grass grows, soil shifts, leaves fall. Weather interferes, as weather has always done, usually without asking permission. Maintenance is part of meaning. The smaller stone arrangements within the larger circles make the construction especially interesting. If the builders had wanted only to mark a boundary, they could have made a simple ring. Instead, they created many individual settings within the circular form. These settings combined stones in repeated shapes. Some were round or oval, some were diamond-shaped. Some circular and square groups are thought to have marked graves. This suggests that the monument grew through meaningful units. Each stone grouping may have had its own purpose within the larger design. A grave marker, a ritual feature, a family or group marker, a repeated symbol, or a place where offerings were made. We should not pretend to know more than we do, but the complexity tells us that the builders were not merely decorating. They were organising space according to rules that mattered to them. A grave marked by stones is more than a burial. It is a way of holding a person in the landscape. The dead do not remain socially neutral in many human societies. They become ancestors, memories, obligations, presences, names repeated in stories, or people whose absence must be given a place. At Ōyu, if many of the stone arrangements marked graves, then the work of building the circles was also the work of making a community of the dead visible. The stones did not just say, "Here is a boundary." They may have said, "Here rests someone who belonged to us. Here is a person remembered. Here is a connection between the living community and those who came before." Over time, as more arrangements were added, the circles would have become denser with memory. The place would not only be old, it would be populated by the past. There is a difference between burying someone and creating a place people return to. A burial can be private or temporary in memory. A cemetery becomes social memory in the ground. It allows return. It allows ceremony. It allows people born later to stand where earlier people stood. If children came to Ōyu with their families, they may have learned who was buried where, which arrangements mattered to their group, what actions should be performed, and why certain stones should not be disturbed. Such knowledge is not learned from a signboard. It is learned through presence. An older person points, a younger person watches. Someone repeats a story. Someone corrects a mistake. Someone says, "Not there, stand here." This is how a sacred place teaches the body. the act of placing stones may itself have been ritualized. In many societies, building a sacred place is not only preparation for ceremony, it is ceremony. The carrying of material, the selection of objects, the order of placement, the people allowed to participate, the words spoken, the food shared afterward, the direction of the movement. All of these can become part of the meaning. At Ōyu, we do not know whether every stone was placed with formal ritual. Some may have been set during practical construction. Others may have marked particular burials or events. But it is difficult to separate the physical act from the social and spiritual one. If a stone marked a grave, then setting it down was not casual. It was an action performed at a moment when people were dealing with death, memory, and the continuity of the group. Even the heavier stone becomes more than weight when grief is involved. The central features of the circles add another layer. Both Manza and Nonokado have arranged stones often described as sundial-like stonework, and the line connecting the centres of the two circles and those features corresponds with the direction of sunset at the summer solstice. This tells us that the builders were not only arranging stones in relation to graves or internal patterns, they were also placing the circles in relation to the sky. The sun's path was part of the site's design, and that means construction required observation before placement. Someone had to know where the sun set at the longest day of the year. Someone had to remember it, mark it, or guide others toward it. The alignment did not appear because a group of stones felt ambitious one afternoon. It reflects attention. That kind of attention comes from living with the sky as part of daily timekeeping. The Jōmon people did not need astronomy in the modern scientific sense to care about the sun. They needed light, warmth, seasonal timing, plant growth, animal movement, river conditions, and the rhythms of gathering and fishing. The solstice is a turning point in daylight. After it, the days begin slowly to shorten. In northern Japan, where winters are long and seasonal change is deeply felt, that turning would have mattered. A stone arrangement that marks or remembers the solstice is a way of tying human ceremony to the year. It says, in stone rather than writing, that this place belongs not only to people, but to the movement of the world around them. The construction of such an alignment did not require modern instruments. It required watching, repeated watching. The kind of watching modern people are often bad at, because we are busy checking devices that tell us what we might have noticed ourselves if we'd been less distracted. If a community watched the sunset point shift along the horizon through the year, they could identify its northernmost or southernmost position. They could mark that direction with posts, stones, sightlines, or memory. The alignment at Ōyu suggests that the builders had long-term familiarity with the horizon. They knew not just the land underfoot, but the way the sun moved above it. The sacred place was made from both directions, stones brought up from the river and attention brought down from the sky. It is worth imagining the work season by season. Perhaps construction or maintenance happened when the ground was not too frozen, when food was available, and when people could gather. In spring, snowmelt would change the rivers and soften the earth. In summer, plants would grow thick and the long days would give more working light. In autumn, food gathering and fish runs might occupy many hands, but abundance might also support gatherings. Winter would make some work harder, but it could also change transport conditions if snow allowed dragging. We should not assume one simple construction season, because a place like Ōyu may have grown over time. Stones may have been added, replaced, adjusted, or maintained across generations. The site may have been less like a building project, with a beginning and end, and more like an ongoing practice. That ongoing practice is important. Sacred places are often made again and again, not because the stones vanish, but because meaning has to be renewed. A ceremony repeats. A grave is visited. A child is introduced to the place. A path is cleared. A stone that has shifted is put back. Food is shared. A story is told. The place remains the same by being used again. This is very different from the modern idea of construction, where a project is finished, inspected, photographed, and then everyone hopes nothing leaks. At Ōyu, the making of the place may have continued through use. The first builders began it, but later generations kept it alive. The tools used in this work would have been simple by modern standards, but not crude. Jōmon people made stone tools, worked wood, twisted cordage, produced pottery, built dwellings, and processed a wide range of materials. Simple tools in skilled hands can accomplish a great deal. A digging stick, stone axe, wooden lever, rope, basket, and fire can transform a landscape when people know what they are doing. We should be careful not to confuse the absence of metal with the absence of engineering. The builders of Ōyu did not need iron tools to arrange river stones with precision. They needed knowledge of material, labour organisation, and repeated practice. The result is still visible after 4,000 years, which is more than can be said for many things assembled with very confident modern packaging instructions. One of the quiet questions behind the circles is who directed the work. Was there a leader, a ritual specialist, a council of elders? A tradition so well understood that no single person needed to command it. The archaeological record cannot give us a neat organisational chart, and perhaps that is just as well, because organisational charts are rarely soothing. Still, the work implies social structure. People had to agree on the importance of the site. They had to know which arrangements belonged where. They had to remember alignments and boundaries. They had to coordinate labour and ceremony. Some individuals may have held special knowledge of burial practices, seasonal timing, or stone placement. Others may have contributed strength, food, tools, or materials. Sacred places are built not only by hands but by social roles. The making of the circles may also have strengthened those roles. When people work together on something larger than ordinary daily tasks, they rehearse belonging. A young person carrying stones learns not only how heavy they are, but why the work matters. An adult placing stones near a grave participates in memory. Elders guiding the process reinforce their authority and knowledge. Visitors from related communities see the shared place and their connection to it. The monument is not just the result of social life, it helps produce social life. By building the circles, people also built relationships. The low nature of the stones may have made them especially tied to movement rather than distant viewing. A tall monument announces itself from far away. Low stone arrangements ask people to come close, walk around, bend their attention downward, notice shapes, and remember positions. The body's movement becomes part of the experience. You do not simply look up in awe, you look down in recognition. You step carefully, you follow the ring, you pass between features, you stand near the centre and look outward toward the horizon. The design teaches through walking. That may be one reason the circles still feel so contemplative. They are not trying to dominate the landscape. They are asking the visitor to slow down enough to read the ground. The ground itself was part of the construction. Stones placed on soil behave differently depending on drainage, slope, frost, roots, and maintenance. If a stone arrangement marks a grave, the soil beneath and around it carries archaeological traces that can tell researchers about disturbance, burial, or repeated activity. If a feature is meant to align with the sun, its position must remain stable enough to preserve the sightline. If many people gather there, paths and open spaces form. Sacred places may seem timeless once they are preserved, but in use they are constantly interacting with weather, plants, feet, and time. The people of Ōyu would have known this in practical ways. A stone out of place might be noticed, grass might need clearing, a path might need keeping open. Ritual attention and landscape maintenance could easily overlap. We can also think about sound during construction. Stones knock against one another with a dull clack. People call instructions. Feet scrape on earth. A heavy stone drops into place with a sound that feels final, even if it is only one of thousands. Nearby, the river continues its own voice, indifferent and necessary. Perhaps work was accompanied by conversation, joking, argument, or song. it is easy to make prehistoric labour too solemn in our minds, as if every person was permanently serious because they lived long ago. But people building together often talk, they complain, they laugh. Someone suggests a better way. Someone insists the old way is better. Someone is right, but annoyingly so. The sacred does not exclude the ordinary. Very often it depends on it. Food would have supported the work. A gathering large enough to build or maintain the circles would require meals. People working with stones need energy. If ceremonies and burials were taking place, food may also have been part of ritual sharing. In many cultures, feasting helps bring people together for labour and ceremony. It creates obligation, generosity, memory, and social display. At Ōyu, we cannot reconstruct a menu for a particular day, but the surrounding Jōmon world offered nuts, fish, game, plants, and foods cooked in pottery. A sacred place is not only built with stones, it is built with meals, because people who are not fed become much less enthusiastic about community projects. The stones also created permanence in a world of organic materials. Jōmon people worked with wood, bark, fibres, hides, plants, and other materials that rarely survive well in the archaeological record. Much of their world has vanished because it was biodegradable, which is a polite way of saying that time ate it. Wooden structures decay, baskets rot, cloth disappears, food remains only in traces, but stone stays. This can distort our view. We see the stones and may think they were the whole monument, but they may have been accompanied by posts, wooden markers, temporary shelters, offerings, fibres, painted or decorated objects and other materials long gone. The sacred place we see today is likely only the durable part of a richer setting. That missing richness should make us cautious. The circles may once have looked more complex than they do now. There may have been fires burning nearby, posts standing in relation to stones, cords marking areas, vessels placed for ceremonies, tools used in preparation, bodies wrapped in materials that have disappeared, and people wearing ornaments or clothing that left only fragments. The stones are the bones of the place, not the full body, and yet bones can tell a great deal. They show structure, they show repeated action, they show the shape of care. The phrase sacred place can sometimes make a site feel distant, as if it belonged only to specialists or solemn rituals. But sacred places are often woven into everyday life. A person may pass near them on the way to another task. Children may grow up with them as a normal part of the landscape. Seasonal gatherings may combine ceremony with exchange, eating, socializing, and practical decisions. The sacred is not always separate from ordinary life. It can be the point where ordinary life is given deeper order. At Ōyu, the circles may have gathered many functions into one landscape: burial, ritual, seasonal observation, community meeting, and the reinforcement of ties between dispersed settlements. The stones made those functions visible and durable. By placing stones from the river on the plateau, the builders changed both materials and place. A stone in the riverbed is part of the river. A stone in a circle becomes part of a social memory. It still carries its natural shape, but now it also carries human placement. This transformation is at the heart of monument making. Humans take materials from the world and arrange them so that they mean something more than they did before. A log becomes a housepost, clay becomes a pot, bone becomes a needle, stone becomes a grave marker, a sightline, a boundary, a centre. Nothing supernatural has to be added for this to be extraordinary. It is extraordinary because it is human, and human work always leaves questions behind. Did the first builders know how large the circles would become? Did they plan Manza and Nonakado together? Or did one inspire the other? Did certain stones matter because of where they came from? Were some carried by relatives of the dead? Were children allowed to help, or did they watch from the side until old enough? Was there a moment when the first stone was placed with ceremony? Was there a final stone? Or did the place continue growing so gradually that no one thought of it as finished? These questions cannot all be answered, but they help us approach the circles as living projects rather than static ruins. The making of Ōyu required a chain of actions that began at the river and ended in shared memory. People selected stones shaped by water. They moved them across land. They arranged them into patterns. They connected some of those patterns with graves. They aligned central features with the sun. They returned, maintained, added, remembered, and taught. Over time, the plateau became different from surrounding ground. Not because the soil itself changed, but because people changed their relationship to it. They made it a place where the dead could be held, the year could be marked, and communities could gather under the open sky. Once the stones were in place, the work did not stop. A sacred place only matters if people continue to use it. Fires were lit, burials were made, objects were handled, ceremonies unfolded in ways we can only partly reconstruct. The circles became settings for actions, not just achievements of construction. The river stones had been carried upward and arranged with care, but now they had to do their quieter work, holding boundaries, marking graves, directing attention, and giving the living a place to return when memory, season, and community called them back to the plateau. Once the stones had been brought from the river and set into the ground, Ōyu was no longer just a plateau near water and forest. It had become a place where people could return, stand together, remember the dead, mark the seasons, and carry out actions that mattered enough to be repeated. The circles did not do their work by themselves. Stones can mark a space, but people make that space active. People arrive with food, tools, objects, stories, grief, obligations, and the kind of shared attention that turns a piece of ground into something more than ground. At Ōyu, the two great circles were surrounded by remains of pillar-supported buildings, storage pits, pit graves, and other features arranged around them, while many ritual objects were found nearby, including clay figurines, clay tablets, animal-shaped and bell-shaped clay objects, stone rods, and stone swords. That combination tells us that the site was not simply a pattern of stones to be admired. It was a place where things happened. Imagine arriving there on a day when the site was in use. Not as a modern visitor reading signs and trying not to step somewhere inappropriate, but as someone who knew the paths, the nearby river, the smell of the forest, and the meaning of particular stones. The plateau is open enough for people to gather. The circles lie low across the ground, not towering overhead, but shaping movement through quiet boundaries. Around them are structures, pits, and cleared areas. Some people may be preparing food. Others may be carrying objects or speaking with relatives from nearby settlements. Children may be watching from the edge, curious and only partly obedient, because children have never been famous for treating important adult silence as a complete explanation. The air may hold smoke from cooking fires or hearths used nearby. We should be careful here. Not every imagined flame can be tied to a specific excavated fire feature in the circles themselves. But in a Jōmon gathering, where people cooked, kept warm, processed food, and perhaps stayed for ceremonies, fire would have been a practical presence, and practical things often become part of a ritual life too. Fire changes a place immediately. It gives warmth, light, smell, sound, and a center. A small flame in daylight is useful. A fire at dusk becomes a gathering point. It makes faces visible. It turns food into meals. It dries, hardens, burns, purifies, destroys, and transforms. For Jōmon people, fire was part of daily technology as much as it was part of ceremony. It cooked nuts, fish, meat, and plant foods. It heated stones and pottery. It made dark hours safer and cold seasons more bearable. It helped harden wooden tools and fire clay into pottery. A community that understood fire as ordinary power could also have used it in moments of ceremony, not because fire needed to be mysterious, but because it was already one of the main ways people changed the world around them. A raw thing becomes cooked. Wet wood becomes smoke and ash. Clay becomes vessel. A body becomes memory. That is not abstract. It is the practical transformation of matter seen again and again. At Ōyu, the strongest direct evidence points toward burial and ritual. The local site explains that stone circles are thought to have been special places for rituals and cemeteries, and that circular and square clusters made from more than 10 stones are believed to have been used as graves. That gives the circles a serious social role. They were not simply meeting places, though people likely met there. They were not simply solar markers, though the alignment toward the summer solstice sunset suggests attention to the movement of the sun. They were places where the living dealt with the dead. This is one of the deepest functions any place can have. A community can live without many things, at least for a while. It can live without permanent walls, without writing, without metal, without clocks, without a single person saying let's circle back to that after lunch. But no community lives without death, and every community has to decide what to do when someone is gone. A burial is not only the placement of a body, it is a social act. It gathers people around absence. It gives form to grief. It says who belongs, who remembers, who has responsibility, and where memory should return. In a place like Ōyu, where stone arrangements may have marked graves, burial would have become part of the larger pattern of the circles. The dead were not hidden randomly in the landscape. They were placed within a meaningful design. Stones held the location. The circle held the stones. The site held the circle. The surrounding communities held the memory of the site. This nesting of memory matters. It means that each grave was not only private sorrow, but part of a shared landscape. Someone standing there may have known which arrangement belonged to which person, which family, which lineage, or which story. We cannot recover those names, but we can recognize the structure of remembering. It is easy to think of ancient burials as silent and still, because that is how they reach archaeologists, but the burial itself would have been full of action. People prepare the body, they dig, they carry, they arrange. They speak, sing, remain silent, or perform gestures whose meanings are now lost. They may place objects nearby, or not, depending on custom, status, age, season, or circumstance. They cover the grave. They set stones. They return later. There may be food shared afterward. There may be smoke, cold air, rain, insects, crying children, tired adults, and someone quietly making sure the work is done correctly. Ritual is often imagined as purely symbolic, but it is also practical. Holes must be dug, stones must be moved, bodies must be handled with care. People need to be guided through a difficult moment so that grief does not remain shapeless. The stone settings at Ōyu may have allowed those acts to become durable. A grave without a marker can be forgotten or disturbed. A grave marked with stones becomes visible to those who know how to read the place. Over time, as more burials were added, the circles may have become a community of ancestors. The living could gather among the dead without the dead being entirely absent. This does not mean we know exactly how Jōmon people imagine the afterlife, ancestors, spirits, or the relationship between bodies and memory. We do not have their words. But the material evidence suggests that death was given repeated, organised attention. When a society invests labour in burial spaces and ritual objects, it is telling us that the dead mattered beyond the moment of death. The ritual objects found around the circles add more detail to that picture. Clay figurines, clay tablets, animal-shaped clay objects, bell-shaped clay objects, stone rods, and stone swords were not the basic equipment of ordinary cooking or tool repair. They suggest acts of offering, representation, protection, prayer, healing, identity, or ceremonial display. Some of these categories are modern guesses, of course, and we should not pretend that every object comes with a neat label. Archaeology often hands us something strange and says, "Here, make sense of this without the instruction booklet." Still, the concentration of these objects around the circles strongly supports the idea that Ōyu was a ritual landscape. People were not only burying their dead, they were making and using objects whose purpose went beyond everyday survival. Clay figurines are especially important in the broader Jōmon world. They appear in many forms across different regions and periods, often stylized, sometimes broken, sometimes found in contexts that suggest ritual use. Their meanings are debated. Some researchers have connected them to fertility, healing, protection, rites of passage, or the handling of misfortune. It is better to avoid one simple answer, because Jōmon figurines were made over thousands of years and across many communities. But at Ōyu, their presence among other ritual objects shows that people use shaped clay to express ideas about bodies, animals, spirits, or forces that matter to them. Clay is humble material, but it is also intimate. It is dug from the earth, mixed with water, shaped by hands, marked by fingers or tools, dried, fired and transformed. A clay figurine carries the touch of its maker in a way a natural stone does not. It is a human-made body, placed within a landscape of human memory. The clay tablets from Ōyu are just as intriguing. The official site describes one tablet with puncture marks representing parts of the human body, using numbers from 1 to 6, with 1 puncture for the mouth and 2 for the eyes. That is a small object, but it opens a surprisingly large window. It suggests people were making symbolic representations of the body, using marks and number-like groupings in a deliberate way. We should not rush to call it writing. It was not writing in the later sense. But it was structured marking. It was a way of putting meaning onto clay, perhaps connected with ritual, teaching, healing, counting, identity, or some system we no longer understand. Hold that tablet in imagination for a moment. It would fit in the hand. It is not monumental like the circles, yet it may have carried meaning just as carefully arranged as the stones. The large and the small belong to the same ceremonial world. Stone rods and stone swords also raise questions. Their names can mislead slightly, because a stone sword in this context does not mean a practical battlefield weapon like a later metal sword. Such objects are usually understood as ritual or symbolic, not tools for ordinary combat. Stone rods, too, often appear in Jōmon ritual contexts. They may have been connected to status, fertility, spiritual power, or ceremonial roles, though exact meanings remain uncertain. What matters is that Ōyu produced a variety of objects whose shapes seem deliberately removed from simple daily function. The people who gathered there were making a material language for ceremony. Stones mark the ground. Clay represented bodies or beings. Special objects were handled, placed, displayed, broken, buried, or kept. The ceremonies under the open sky may have involved many kinds of material action. And then there were buildings. Around the circles, archaeologists found remains of pillar-supported buildings and other features arranged concentrically. These structures are important because they suggest that the site was organised beyond the rings themselves. Pillar-supported buildings could have been used in different ways, for storage, ritual display, temporary gathering needs, or functions we cannot define with certainty. The local site also mentions remains of pit houses, pillar-supported buildings and peristyllium, with some reconstructed and maintained for visitors today. A ceremonial site needs infrastructure, even if that word feels a bit modern and sounds as if someone should be holding a clipboard. People gathering for rituals need places to store goods, prepare objects, shelter from weather, organise activities, and perhaps separate ordinary tasks from more restricted actions. The buildings around Ōyu may have helped support the ceremonies that took place within and around the circles. The storage pits are also worth noticing. Storage might seem less dramatic than graves or ritual objects, but in a Jōmon setting it is deeply important. To store food is to plan across time. It allows a community to support gatherings, survive lean seasons, and manage abundance when fish, nuts, or other resources are available in quantity. Storage pits around a ceremonial landscape might have held foods or materials connected with gatherings, feasting, offerings, or practical support. We do not need to imagine every pit as sacred in itself. But the presence of storage features near the circles reminds us that ritual life depends on ordinary supplies. People cannot conduct ceremonies indefinitely on atmosphere. Someone has to bring food, someone has to store it, someone has to remember where it is, and someone, inevitably, has to tell a child not to open that pit just to look. Feasting may have been part of gatherings at Ōyu, though the exact evidence for particular meals at the site must be handled carefully. In many prehistoric societies, communal ceremonies and burial events include shared food, because eating together creates bonds, obligations, and memory. For Jōmon communities, foods from the surrounding forests and rivers, nuts, fish, plants, game, could have supported group gatherings. A burial ceremony followed by shared food would not be surprising in human terms, nor would a seasonal gathering linked to the summer solstice or other times of the year. Food helps bring people from different households or settlements into one social event. It rewards labour, it honours guests, it marks transitions, it says we are gathered and we belong, at least for this moment, around the same fire, the same food, the same dead, the same stones. The open sky mattered too. Ōyu was not a cave, not an enclosed temple, not a hidden chamber deep underground. The circles were outside, exposed to weather, daylight, clouds, stars, insects, snow, wind, and the changing colour of the horizon. That openness is part of the experience. The sun's movement could be seen. The summer solstice sunset could be observed along the line connecting the centres of the two circles and their sundial-like stonework. Ceremonies held in such a place would have taken place inside a larger natural theatre. The sky was not decoration, it was part of the setting. A cloud passing over the sun, a cold wind before rain, a clear sunset on the longest day, the arrival of dusk after a burial, all of these would affect how people experienced the ceremony. Standing under the open sky also means that ceremonies were tied to weather in a very real way. Modern rituals often move indoors when it rains, with a backup plan involving folding chairs and someone apologising into a microphone. At Ōyu, the weather may have been accepted as part of the event. Rain could darken stones, snow could cover them, summer heat could make the grass smell stronger, autumn wind could scatter leaves across the arrangements. These changes would not erase the site's meaning, they would layer it. The circles were built to remain through weather. People returned not to a static stage, but to a place that changed with the seasons and still held its pattern. The summer solstice alignment deserves to be considered together with burial. It would be too simple to say the circles were either a cemetery or a calendar. Ancient sites often hold more than one purpose. The local official description directly notes both cemetery and ritual interpretations, along with the solstice alignment. This combination suggests that the people at Ōyu may have linked human life and death to the larger cycle of the year. The longest day is a turning point. After it, daylight begins to shorten, very slowly at first, almost politely, then more noticeably. In northern Japan, the movement from long light toward winter would not have been a minor detail. It shaped food, travel, warmth, work, and mood. A ceremony at or near such a turning point could connect the dead, the living, and the changing year in one shared act. We should be cautious about using the word prayer, because we do not know the exact beliefs or words used at Ōyu. The local site, however, describes the remains as traces of prayer of gratitude for nature, which reflects a common interpretation that the site was connected with ritual thanks, reverence, or spiritual attention to natural forces. Gratitude would make sense in a landscape where survival depended on returning gifts from forest and river. Salmon do not appear because humans command them. Nuts do not ripen because people are hungry. Snow does not leave because everyone has had quite enough. A society living closely with seasonal abundance and scarcity may develop ceremonies that acknowledge dependence on forces beyond human control. The rituals at Ōyu may have helped people express thanks, seek protection, remember the dead, and maintain proper relationships with the world around them. This does not mean Jōmon people were simple nature worshippers in a vague decorative sense. That phrase can flatten complex lives. Their relationship with nature was not just admiration. It was work, risk, knowledge, and negotiation. They knew which plants required processing, which fish returned when, which materials could be used for tools, which seasons were generous, and which could be dangerous. Ceremony in such a world is not separate from knowledge. It may be one way of organizing knowledge socially. If a community gathers at a certain season, tells certain stories, performs certain actions, and marks certain directions in stone, then practical memory and spiritual meaning can reinforce each other. The ceremony helps people remember when to gather, who they are connected to, where the dead are placed, and what the landscape provides. The presence of pit graves around the circles also suggests that Ōyu was not just used once or briefly. Burial places grow over time. They require repeated visits and repeated decisions. One burial leads to another. A pattern becomes recognized. New graves are placed in relation to old ones. The circle accumulates significance. The official Jōmon site describes each stone circle as surrounded by pit graves and other features arranged concentrically. This kind of organization implies long-term planning, or at least a long-term tradition of placement. People knew where graves should go. They knew how they should relate to the circle. They were not simply digging wherever the ground was soft. The dead were being placed within an ordered landscape. A ceremony for burial may also have marked transitions for the living. When someone dies, the community changes. A parent is gone. A child is gone. A skilled gatherer, hunter, maker, storyteller, or elder is gone. Their tasks must be taken up by others. Their relationships must be rearranged. Their knowledge may survive in memory or be lost if not passed on. Burial ritual helps a group move through that change. It allows people to say, in action, if not in surviving words, "This person is now placed with those who came before, and we who remain must continue." The stones hold the grave, the ceremony holds the community. There may also have been ceremonies not directly tied to burial, seasonal rites, gatherings of dispersed groups, offerings connected with river and forest resources, rites involving clay figurines or tablets, and ceremonies linked to the sun's movement are all possibilities suggested by the site's features and objects. The purpose of the monuments remains partly mysterious, but excavations have revealed what appear to be burials, and the central sundial-like arrangement suggests a solar connection. That mystery is not empty, it is structured. We know enough to say that Ōyu was ceremonial and funerary. We do not know enough to recite the ceremonies. The missing details invite imagination, but good imagination should keep one foot on the ground, preferably not directly on a grave marker. Picture a gathering near sunset. The stones are already familiar to those present. Some people stand near Manza, others closer to Nonakado. Smoke lifts from a cooking fire or hearth nearby, not necessarily in the exact centre of the circle, but close enough that the smell drifts through the gathering. Food has been prepared, perhaps fish, nuts, plants, or meat depending on season. A clay object is brought out. It may be handled by someone with a particular role. A burial has been prepared, or an offering is being made, or a seasonal ceremony is unfolding. The sun lowers toward the horizon. People are not thinking like modern archaeologists. They are not separating the event into categories: funerary, astronomical, social, ecological. They are simply doing what their community knows to do at this place. That is an important point. The categories are ours. The experience was theirs. When we say ritual, we may imagine something separate from ordinary life. When we say cemetery, we may imagine a place visited only for mourning. When we say solar alignment, we may imagine scientific observation. At Ōyu, these things may have belonged together. A gathering could honour the dead, mark the season, share food, exchange news, strengthen alliances, and give thanks for natural abundance. One event can do many kinds of work. A modern wedding can be a legal contract, family reunion, religious ceremony, social performance, meal, dance, financial challenge, and test of seating chart diplomacy all at once. Ancient ceremonies were likely just as layered, though with fewer photographers and probably better baskets. The open-air setting also meant that everyone present could see the same sky and horizon. Shared attention is powerful. When a group watches the sun set from a marked place, the event belongs to all of them. When a body is placed in a grave and stones are set above it, the memory is anchored in public ground. When a clay figurine is broken, offered, or placed, the act becomes part of communal knowledge. The circles helped focus that shared attention. They provided form so that actions did not dissolve into ordinary movement. A circle tells people this is the place. A grave marker tells them this person is remembered here. A central alignment tells them, look this way. Ritual needs such cues. People are forgetful creatures. We need markers, paths, gestures, songs, schedules, and occasionally several reminders to bring something important. Ōyu may also have helped connect communities across the region. The local interpretation suggests that the circles functioned as a shared ritual and cemetery site in a period when smaller settlements may have needed stronger bonds with one another. A communal ceremonial place can be a kind of social anchor. People who do not live in the same household or settlement can still belong to the same ritual landscape. They return to the same stones. They recognize the same arrangements. They bury their dead in relation to a shared pattern. They participate in ceremonies that remind them of wider identity. This would have mattered in a world without written contracts, state borders, or official membership cards, which, to be fair, are not always as emotionally satisfying as a stone circle. The ceremonies under the open sky may therefore have been as much about the living as the dead. The dead gave the place depth, but the living gave it continuity. Each gathering renewed relationships among people who had to cooperate, exchange, marry, share knowledge, and perhaps help one another in difficult seasons. The circles created a setting where those relationships could be seen and reinforced. Who attends? Who brings food? Who leads? Who follows? Who mourns with whom? Who stands near which stones? All of this matters in a community. Social structure is not only spoken, it is performed. At the same time, we should not imagine the site as always crowded or active. Sacred places often spend most of their time quiet. Days pass with no ceremony. Grass grows. Birds move through. Rain falls on the stones. Snow covers them. The river continues below. Then, at certain times, people return, and the place becomes active again. This rhythm of quiet and gathering may have been part of its power. The circles waited. They held their form between events. When people came back, the stones were still there, ready to receive the next burial, the next offering, the next shared meal, the next watching of the sun. That waiting is one reason the site still affects us. We come long after the last Jōmon ceremony ended, but the stones remain in their patient arrangement. The fires are gone, the voices are gone, the food has vanished, the wooden structures have decayed or survive only as traces. The bodies are archaeological evidence now, no longer remembered by name. But the plan of the place survives well enough for us to see that the people of Ōyu were doing something careful, repeated, and meaningful. They made a landscape where death, season, community, and the natural world met in visible form. The ceremonies are gone, but their setting still asks us to slow down. And when we slow down, the site becomes less like a mystery to solve, and more like a human place to understand. Fires may have warmed gatherings and cooked food. Burials placed the dead within the order of the circles. Ritual objects gave ceremony material form. The open sky connected the site to the sun and seasons. Structures and pits supported the practical needs of gathering. The stones gave memory a shape that could outlast wood, cloth, voices, and even the names of the people who stood there. From here, the question of time begins to come forward again. Not time as a clock on a wall, but time as seasons, shadows, returning light, and the careful watching of a horizon where the sun, year after year, lowered itself toward the same point beyond the stones. The stones at Ōyu do not rise high enough to catch the sun like towers, and they do not throw long dramatic shadows across the land like the standing stones of some other ancient places. They sit close to the ground, patient and low, as if they were more interested in listening than announcing themselves. And yet the sun is there in the design. Not in a loud way, not in a way that turns the site into a simple prehistoric clock with a convenient instruction label, because ancient places are rarely that tidy. But in the relationship between the two great circles, their central stone arrangements, and the direction of the summer solstice sunset, we can see that the people who built Ōyu were paying attention not only to the river beneath them and the forest around them, but to the sky above them as well. The circles were made from stones, but they were also made from observation. They were made from standing in the same landscape again and again, watching where the sun moved, where it rose, where it set, how the light changed, how the year turned, and how the world slowly told people what season they were living in. For people 4,000 years ago in northern Japan, the sun was not just a bright object overhead. It was not something to be checked in a weather app or complained about during a hot afternoon. Although one suspects people have been complaining about weather for as long as there have been people and weather available at the same time. The sun shaped almost everything. It warmed the ground. It drew plants upward. It marked the length of days. It helped govern when snow melted, when rivers changed, when plants sprouted, when nuts ripened, when fish returned, when insects came out, when animals shifted their patterns, and when people had enough daylight to work, travel, gather, process, build, repair, or simply sit outside a little longer before darkness settled in. The sun was a practical force before it was anything else. It was part of the technology of survival, not because anyone controlled it, but because everyone had to read it. Modern time often comes to us in numbers. A glowing screen tells us 7:30, a phone tells us Tuesday, a calendar tells us a meeting is about to begin, which is rarely as exciting as the calendar seems to think. We divide time into equal boxes, seconds, minutes, hours, weeks, months. We let machines count for us. But for the people of the Jōmon world, time was experienced as change in the living environment. The year was not a row of printed squares, it was a sequence of conditions. The quality of light shifted, the air changed, the forest smelled different. Rivers rose and fell, fish appeared, nuts matured, snow-covered paths, leaves opened and then dropped, birds arrived and left. The body itself noticed the year, waking into warmth, bracing against cold, working harder in abundance, enduring scarcity. In such a world, watching the sun was not a scientific hobby separated from daily life. It was one of the ways a community understood where it stood in the cycle of the year. The summer solstice would have been especially noticeable. It is the longest day of the year, the point when the sun reaches the farthest limit of its seasonal path before beginning the slow return toward shorter days. In northern Japan, where winter can be long, cold and snow-heavy, the difference between seasons is not a small background detail. It changes how people move, what they eat, where they work, and how they prepare. The longest day does not arrive wearing a label, of course. No one in the late Jōmon period woke up and said, "Ah yes, the solstice, better update the calendar." But if people watched the horizon over many years, they could see the pattern. The sunset point shifts gradually across the horizon through the seasons. Day after day, the movement is small, almost too quiet to notice. But over weeks and months, it becomes clear. The sun sets farther and farther along one part of the horizon, then pauses, then begins to move back. That pause, that turning point, is what a solstice is. To notice that, a person needs patience. Not a dramatic kind of patience, but ordinary repeated attention. The kind that comes from living in the same place and needing to understand it. Someone watches the sunset from the plateau. Someone remembers where it went down at different times of year. Someone marks a point. Someone compares it with the previous season. Perhaps stones, posts, trees, ridges, or other landscape features help fix the direction in memory. Perhaps the knowledge is held by elders or ritual specialists. Perhaps it is common knowledge among people who gather at certain times. However it was learned, the alignment at Ōyu suggests that the builders were not arranging stones only by what looked balanced on the ground. They were relating the ground to the horizon. This is where the site becomes quietly remarkable. The line that connects the centres of the Manas and Nonakado circles and their central sundial-like stone arrangements points toward the sunset at the summer solstice. That does not mean Ōyu was simply an astronomical observatory in the modern sense. It was not a Jōmon version of a laboratory, with someone carefully recording data and muttering about measurement errors while everyone else tried not to disturb the experiment. It was a ceremonial and burial place, a gathering place, a landscape of memory. But the sun's path was built into that landscape. The people who made the circles seem to have used the sky as part of the design. The circles were not only laid across the plateau, they were oriented within a seasonal world. The phrase sundial-like can be useful, but it can also mislead if we're not careful. When we hear sundial, we may imagine a device for telling the hour, with a shadow moving neatly across markings, perhaps in a garden where someone has placed a decorative stone frog nearby, for reasons known only to them. At Ōyu, the central stone arrangements are not necessarily clocks in that narrow sense. They may have marked direction, focused attention, or helped indicate solar movement at important points in the year. They may have had symbolic or ritual importance as well. A shadow can tell time, but it can also create a moment. It can show that the sun is in the right place. It can confirm that a season has arrived. It can bring people into shared attention. The important thing is not that the stones told people it was 3:47 in the afternoon. The important thing is that they helped connect human action to celestial rhythm. If you stand in an open place long enough, shadows become very interesting. Most of us do not notice them much, unless we're trying to take a flattering photograph or find a shady place for lunch. But shadows are one of the most basic ways the sun makes time visible. In the morning, shadows stretch one way. At midday, they shorten. In the evening, they lengthen and reach in another direction. Across the year, the path of shadows changes with the height of the sun. A fixed stone, post or marker can turn those changes into something observable and repeatable. A shadow is not permanent, but its behaviour can be learned. It is a moving sign made by a still object and a moving sun. That combination is simple, elegant, and very old. The people at Ōyu may have used shadows in ways we can only partly reconstruct. Maybe certain shadows fell across stones at specific times. Maybe the central arrangements helped mark the solstice direction. Maybe the important moment was not the shadow itself, but the sight line towards sunset. Maybe people gathered near the stones to watch the sun lower into the horizon at the longest day. We should avoid pretending we can describe the exact ceremony. The past has not handed us a script with stage directions, but we can say that the builders knew the sun's movement mattered, and they placed stones in ways that suggest it was built into the site's meaning. That brings us to a larger point about time. For the Jōmon people, time at Ōyu was probably not only measured, it was enacted. A community does not simply know a season has arrived. It does things when the season arrives. It gathers certain foods. It prepares certain tools. It moves through certain routes. It performs certain ceremonies. It remembers certain dead. It may return to a particular place. The calendar is not just a mental system. It is a pattern of action. The circles at Ōyu may have helped structure those actions. A solstice alignment does not matter only because the sun sets in a certain direction. It matters because people gather to see it, because ceremonies happen around it, because the dead are remembered within that same pattern, because the return of light and the turning of the year become part of community life. The connection between the sun and burial is especially worth holding gently. The circles were likely used as cemeteries and ritual places. If graves were marked within the stone arrangements, then the dead were placed inside a landscape oriented toward the sun's seasonal movement. We cannot say exactly what that meant to the people who built it, but we can understand why it might matter. The sun returns each day. The year returns through its seasons. Plants die back and grow again. Fish leave and come back. Nuts fall, disappear into storage, and sustain people through cold months. Human life, by contrast, does not return in the same simple way. A person dies, and their place in the community changes forever. But by placing the dead in a landscape tied to cycles, the living may have found a way to hold loss within a larger pattern of return and continuity. That does not mean they believed exactly what we might expect. They may not have separated nature, spirit, ancestor, and time into neat categories. Those categories are modern tools and useful ones, but they can make ancient life look more divided than it was. A burial ceremony, a solstice gathering, a shared meal, an offering of thanks, and a community meeting may have overlapped. The same event could honour the dead, affirm social ties, mark the season, and express gratitude for the living world. Human rituals are very good at doing several jobs at once. Even now, a holiday meal can be family reunion, religious observance, seasonal marker, emotional test, and competitive pie evaluation all in one afternoon. Ancient ceremonies were probably no less layered. The summer solstice also sits in an interesting place within the food year. It does not mark the deepest abundance of autumn, when nuts and many stored foods become central. It comes earlier, as the growing season is unfolding, as long daylight supports plants and work. In northern landscapes, the long days of early summer can feel like a release from the hardness of winter. The sun lingers, the air opens, travel becomes easier, plants grow quickly, people can gather, repair, fish, hunt, build, and prepare. A ceremony around the longest day may have acknowledged not only the sun itself, but the period of activity and growth it made possible. Then, after the solstice, the days slowly shorten, even while summer continues. There is something practical and slightly humbling in that. At the moment of greatest light, the turn toward darkness has already begun. The year is generous, but it is also moving. People who live by seasonal resources understand that timing is everything. Collect nuts too early and they are not ready. Wait too long and animals, weather, or decay may take them first. Fish runs must be met when they happen. Plant foods must be gathered when they are useful. Wood must be collected before cold makes everything harder. Skins must be treated before they spoil. Storage must be filled before scarcity arrives. Time is not abstract in such a world. It is edible or not edible, safe or dangerous, too early or too late. A stone alignment that helps mark the turning year is therefore not only symbolic, it belongs to practical survival. It helps the community hold a shared sense of timing. Still, no one lives on practicality alone. Humans make meaning because survival without meaning is thin. At Ōyu, the sun's movement may have provided a way to connect practical time with social and spiritual time. The longest day could be recognized as a moment to gather. The setting sun could draw attention toward a horizon known to everyone present. The stones could frame the direction. The dead could be remembered within the ordered pattern. Food could be shared. Objects could be used. Stories could be told. The ceremony could say, in action rather than writing, that the community lives within a world that turns, returns, gives, and takes away. There is also the matter of repetition. A solstice is not impressive only because it happens once. It is powerful because it returns. The sun reaches its limit, turns back, and does so again the next year, and the year after, and the year after that. A community that marks such a moment builds expectation into the landscape. People know they will return. Children who are brought to the site one year may come back as adults. Adults who once stood with elders may later become the ones who explain the stones. A burial made one season may be visited in another. The repeated return to the same place at the same seasonal moment turns individual memory into shared tradition. It gives people a way to feel continuity across generations. This may be one reason stones were such suitable materials. Wood can mark a place, but it decays. Clay can be shaped, but it breaks. Fire burns brightly, then becomes ash. A song lasts only while it is sung, unless someone remembers it. But stones can remain through repeated returns. They give the community something stable within the changing year. The sun moves, the seasons change, people age, children grow, elders die, food comes and goes, snow covers and melts. But the stones remain in their places, or close enough that they can be restored if shifted. They provide a fixed pattern against which change can be recognized. In a world of cycles, stones are memory's patient furniture. The circles themselves also express time in their form. A circle has no obvious beginning or end. You can move around it and return to where you started. That does not mean the builders used the circle for that symbolic reason, but it does make the form well suited to a place of seasonal return. The year itself feels circular in many ways. Spring, summer, autumn, winter, then spring again. Yet human life does not simply circle back. A person ages, a child becomes an adult. The dead do not rejoin the living as they were, so the circle at Ōyu may have held two kinds of time at once, cyclical time in the seasons and linear time in human lives. The sun returns, but a person buried in the circle is gone from daily life. The community returns, but it returns changed. The stones hold both truths without needing to explain them. It is easy to underestimate how carefully people without writing can preserve knowledge. We sometimes act as if a fact becomes real only once it is written down, preferably in a report with footnotes and a chart that makes everyone look serious. But oral and practical knowledge can be precise, especially when it is reinforced by repeated use. The position of the summer solstice sunset can be remembered through landmarks, stories, ceremonies, and the physical orientation of stones. Children learn by watching, adults confirm by doing. The site itself becomes a teaching device. You do not need a written calendar if your landscape, community practices, and seasonal tasks hold the calendar together. That does not make Jōmon timekeeping vague. It makes it embodied. A person knows the time of year because of what they are doing and what the land is doing. The body knows the cold, the hands know which foods are being processed, the eyes know the sunset direction, the feet know the path to the gathering place, the stomach knows whether stored food is plentiful or running low. The community knows when it is time to meet because the season is visible in many signs at once. This kind of timekeeping is not less intelligent than mechanical time. It is different. It is less detached from the world and more woven into it. The sky at night may also have mattered, although the most direct evidence at Ōyu points us toward the sun and solstice alignment. In a place without electric light, the night sky would have been far more visible than it is for many people today. Stars, moon phases, darkness, and seasonal constellations could all help people orient themselves in time, but it is important not to overstate what we know. The stones at Ōyu give us a solar clue, not a complete astronomy textbook. Still, the broader point remains. People living under open skies tend to know those skies. They know when the moon gives enough light to travel. They know the dark of clouded nights. They know the way dawn comes differently in winter and summer. They may not describe it in modern scientific language, but their attention is often exact because it has to be. The movement of light across the stone circles would have changed throughout the day. Morning light would touch one side first, midday light would flatten shadows, evening light would lengthen them across the arrangements. On clear days, stones would warm under the sun. After rain, they would darken. In winter, snow might soften the shapes until only parts of the arrangements showed through. At the summer solstice, the long daylight would make the site feel open and extended. At other times of year, the same place would feel different. The sacred landscape is not a fixed picture. It is a set of relationships that weather and light continually redraw. Perhaps this is why the site still invites quiet thought. It reminds us that time is not only something humans invented to organize ourselves. Time is also the movement of the world through change. We may have digital clocks and atomic standards now, but our bodies still respond to daylight. We still feel winter differently from summer. We still become slightly different people when a long evening gives us more light after dinner. or when early darkness makes us want soup, blankets, and a level of indoor seriousness that would surprise our summer selves. The Jōmon people at Ōyu lived much closer to those rhythms, but the rhythms have not left us. We have simply put many layers of technology between ourselves and the horizon, and yet, even now, many people still mark solstices, equinoxes, New Year's, harvests, birthdays, anniversaries, and memorial days. We still need moments when time becomes visible, when a date is not just a number but a gathering, a meal, a visit to a grave, a candle, a walk, a phone call, or a quiet pause. The people at Ōyu did not share our calendars, but they may have shared that human need to give time a place. The summer solstice sunset seen between or beyond the stones could have given the community a shared point in the year. The circles gave that point a physical setting. The dead, the living, the sun, the river, and the forest were not separate topics. They met on the plateau. So when we imagine the sun between the stones, we should not picture a dramatic special effect. No beam of light needs to unlock a hidden chamber. No ancient mechanism needs to grind open while everyone gasps, though it must be admitted that this would make archaeology documentaries much easier to trailer. The real wonder is quieter. People watched the sun carefully enough to place stones in relation to it. They built a ceremonial landscape where seasonal time, social memory, and burial practice could come together. They made the turning of the year part of the ground. That is enough, more than enough. As daylight lowered toward the solstice horizon, the stones would not have spoken, but they would have helped people know where to look. Around them were the signs of daily and ceremonial life, pottery used for cooking, and perhaps for offerings, tools shaped by skilled hands, clay figures and tablets carrying meanings now partly lost, food gathered from forest and river, and people whose ordinary work made extraordinary gatherings possible. The sun gave the site its larger rhythm, but the life around the stones gave that rhythm substance, and to understand that life more closely, we have to move from the horizon back down to the hands, the hearths, the vessels, the meals, the repairs, and the everyday objects through which the people of Ōyu lived inside the passing year. The sun may have marked the larger rhythm of Ōyu, but daily life happened closer to the hands. It happened in the weight of a pot lifted near a hearth, in the scraping of a stone tool, in the smell of fish being cooked or dried, in the cracking of nuts, in the shaping of clay, in the repairing of a basket, in the careful teaching of a child who was old enough to help but not quite old enough to be trusted with anything fragile. The stone circles give us the broad shape of ceremony, but pottery and ordinary objects bring people closer. They remind us that the builders of Ōyu were not simply mysterious figures arranging stones beneath the sky. They were makers, cooks, gatherers, fishers, hunters, parents, children, elders, visitors, mourners and neighbours. They had weather to deal with, meals to prepare, tools to maintain, and probably, because this is a human constant, at least one person in every group who was very sure they knew the best way to do something. The Jōmon world is famous for pottery, and with good reason. The very name Jōmon comes from the cord-marked patterns pressed into clay vessels, patterns made by twisting or rolling cords across wet clay before firing. The Metropolitan Museum of Art notes that the term refers to these cord markings, and that Jōmon people lived mostly in pit dwellings, obtained food by gathering, fishing and hunting, and made ceramics that became one of the most recognisable features of the culture. But pottery was not only decoration, and it was not only an archaeological label, it was a working technology. A pot changes what people can eat, how they can cook, how long they can store things, and how meals can be shared. Before pottery, foods can be roasted, smoked, dried, pounded, or cooked directly in fire, but a clay vessel adds boiling, simmering, soaking, and stewing. It lets water and heat work together, and once water and heat begin cooperating, a great many stubborn foods become more agreeable. That mattered in a landscape where nuts, plants, fish, and other seasonal resources had to be processed carefully. Official Jōmon culture materials describe gathering, fishing and hunting as the main bases of food life, with mountain vegetables and nuts such as chestnuts, walnuts, and Japanese horse chestnuts among important foods. Chestnuts were useful because they could be eaten without removing bitterness and could be stored, while Japanese horse chestnuts required soaking to remove their bitter taste. This is the kind of detail that turns prehistory from a blur into a kitchen. Someone had to know which nut could be eaten more simply and which needed patient preparation. Someone had to remember how long to soak it, when to change the water, how to grind or cook it, how to dry or store it, and how to stop a hungry child from sampling the wrong thing too early. Knowledge like this does not appear out of nowhere. It is learned through generations, through mistakes, correction, taste, illness avoided, and meals successfully made. Pottery made that knowledge easier to put into practice. A clay vessel could sit near a hearth, filled with water, nuts, roots, leaves, fish, or meat. It could hold food while flavors softened together. It could help process ingredients that would otherwise be difficult or unsafe. It could keep water hot. It could store dried materials or prepared foods. Some vessels might have been used every day until they cracked or blackened. Others may have been made for more formal or ceremonial purposes. At Ōyu, excavated pottery includes large urn-like vessels used to inter the remains of the deceased, as well as elaborately decorated bowls and vases displayed at the Ōyu Stone Circles museum. That range is important. Pottery belonged both to the world of meals and to the world of burial. Clay could serve soup, store nuts, hold offerings, or receive the dead. Or, a vessel is a practical object, but in human hands, practicality rarely stays in its own lane. Imagine a pot being made somewhere near a settlement connected to Ōyu. Clay is gathered, cleaned, mixed, kneaded, and shaped. The maker understands how wet the clay should be, how thick the walls can be without collapsing, how to join coils, how to smooth the surface, how to press cord marks or add decoration, how long to dry it before firing, how to place it near heat without cracking it too quickly. None of that is automatic. Clay is patient, but only up to a point. Too wet, and it slumps. Too dry, and it breaks. Heated too fast, and it cracks, perhaps with a small sharp sound that would have made the maker stare at it in the ancient equivalent of deep disappointment. Pottery making required touch, timing, skill, and memory. The finished vessel carried all of that, even before it was used. Some Jōmon pottery is strikingly decorated with raised designs, rims that seem almost sculptural, and surfaces full of energy. Not all vessels were that elaborate, and regional styles varied widely across the long Jōmon period. But the creativity of Jōmon ceramics is one of the reasons they continue to fascinate people today. Yet even the plainest pot has its own kind of importance. Daily use pottery may not be as visually dramatic as a ceremonial vessel, but it sat at the centre of ordinary survival. It was handled repeatedly. It became familiar. People knew which pot was good for cooking, which one leaked slightly, which one was too heavy, which one someone should have repaired last season and did not. A household is made partly from such familiar objects, the things used so often that they become almost invisible until they break. At Ōyu, the pottery and ritual objects found around the circle suggest that gatherings at the site were supported by a rich material life. Official descriptions mention clay figurines, clay tablets, animal-shaped and bell-shaped clay objects, stone rods, and stone swords found around the circles, along with buildings, storage pits, pit graves, and other features arranged around the stone circles. This means the people who came there did not arrive empty-handed. They brought objects, or made objects, or used objects kept for ceremonial purposes. Some may have carried food in vessels. Some may have brought decorated pottery, figurines, tools, ornaments, or prepared offerings. Some objects were probably ordinary enough to be used without special attention. Others may have been handled carefully, shown only at certain times, or used by people with particular roles. The site was not silent stone alone. It was clay, wood, cord, food, fire, bodies, and speech. Clay figurines, often called dog, open another doorway into the lives of Jōmon people, though it is a doorway with fog on the other side. These figurines appear in many forms across Jōmon Japan. Some are human-like, some highly stylized, some broken, some whole, some found in contexts that suggest ritual use. Their exact meanings remain debated, and it would be too easy to say they were simply fertility figures, healing charms, spirit images, or protective objects, as if one label could politely tidy up thousands of years of practice. At Ōyu, their presence among other ceremonial objects suggests that shaped clay was used to represent or engage with ideas beyond everyday cooking. A figurine is not a pot, though both are clay. A pot holds something. A figurine shows something, or stands for something, or participates in something. Even if we cannot translate its meaning, we can recognize that someone shaped it with intention. The clay tablets are equally intriguing. One well-known clay tablet from Ōyu has puncture marks interpreted as representing parts of the human body, with marks arranged in numbers from 1 to 6. Official site information describes 1 puncture for the mouth, 2 for the eyes, and so on. This does not mean the Jōmon people at Ōyu had writing in the later sense, but it does show structured marking and symbolic thinking. A small object could hold a pattern of meaning. A person could mark clay so that others who knew the system could understand it. Perhaps it had to do with the body, healing, counting, ritual, teaching, or ideas we cannot neatly reconstruct. It is a small thing compared with the stone circles, but small objects often bring us closer to thought than large monuments do. A stone circle tells us where people gathered. A marked tablet hints at how they organized meaning in the hand. Then there were stone tools and objects. Some stone objects from Ōyu were fashioned into shapes such as swords, bowls, and flat triangular plates, and many excavated objects are believed to have served ceremonial purposes rather than ordinary practical ones. But daily life also depended on practical stone tools: cutting, scraping, woodworking, hunting equipment, grinding, pounding, and preparing food. A good tool is more than a shaped piece of stone. It is an extension of learned motion. A scraper in an inexperienced hand is one thing. In a skilled hand, it becomes efficient, almost quiet. It removes hide, shapes wood, cuts fibre, prepares food, or repairs something needed before dark. The tools of Jōmon daily life were not crude simply because they were made without metal. They were adapted to the tasks people needed to do. Crude tools do not sustain communities across thousands of years. Skilled tools do. Food preparation would have filled much of ordinary life. Hunting and fishing can sound exciting, but the work that follows is just as important. Fish must be cleaned, cooked, dried, smoked, stored, or eaten quickly. Meat must be butchered. Bones may be saved. Hides may be treated. Nuts must be collected, sorted, cracked, soaked, ground, roasted, boiled, or stored. Plants must be recognized, gathered in season, prepared properly, and sometimes combined with other foods. A meal in the Jōmon world was not something that appeared because someone opened a cupboard and made a heroic decision between 2 kinds of noodles. It was the result of many earlier actions: gathering, processing, tool-making, fire management, pottery-making, storage, and knowledge of the land. Research on ancient Japanese pottery has shown how closely pottery and aquatic foods could be connected. A study led by researchers at the University of York examined residues on hundreds of pottery vessels and concluded that hunter-gatherer communities in Japan used ceramic vessels to store and process fish, initially salmon, and later a wider range of freshwater and marine foods as fishing intensified. This is especially interesting for Ōyu because nearby rivers offered salmon and trout. The pot and the river belong together in the imagination. A fish taken from moving water could be carried back, cut, cooked in a vessel, shared at a hearth, dried for later, or perhaps prepared for a gathering. The same river that shaped stones for the circles could also provide food cooked in Jōmon pots. One landscape, many uses. Daily life also depended on dwellings. Jōmon people commonly lived in pit dwellings, often arranged around central open spaces in settlements. A pit dwelling was not glamorous in the way a palace is glamorous, but it was practical. It held warmth better than a structure entirely above ground. It created a sheltered interior. It gave a family or household a place to sleep, store items, work, talk, and wait out bad weather. The roof likely used wood, bark, thatch, earth, or other organic materials that rarely survive, which means archaeology preserves only part of the original structure. But the basic idea is clear. People were not merely camping in a casual way. They built homes, they returned to them, they organised life around them. Inside or near such a dwelling, the day would have been crowded with tasks. Someone tends a fire, someone mends a net, cord, basket or garment. Someone shapes a tool, someone watches a child, someone checks stored food, someone prepares clay, someone returns from gathering with plants or nuts, someone repairs a roof section before rain finds the weakness, because rain has an ancient talent for locating human optimism. There may be conversation, instruction, teasing, worry, and rest. We often think of the past through its most impressive remains, but most of life happens in maintenance. Food, shelter, tools, relationships, bodies. A community survives because people keep doing necessary things day after day, even when no one 4,000 years later will call those things monumental. And yet daily life is what made Ōyu possible, made. Without everyday skill, there could be no ceremonial gathering. Without pots, food preparation becomes harder. Without stored foods, large meetings become more difficult. Without tools, stones cannot be moved efficiently, wood cannot be worked, dwellings cannot be built, fish cannot be processed, and clothes or coverings cannot be repaired. Without children learning tasks, knowledge does not continue. The stone circles may have been the most visible achievement, but they rested on an invisible foundation of everyday labour. A sacred place is never built only on belief. It is built on meals, hands, fuel, storage, clothing, paths, and all the small things that keep people alive long enough to gather. Who gathered at Ōyu? We cannot name them, but we can imagine categories of people grounded in what communities require. Elders who carried memory of past ceremonies and earlier burials. Adults strong enough to move stones, prepare food, hunt, fish, gather and build. Skilled makers of pottery, tools, ornaments, cords and wooden objects. Children watching, helping, learning, sometimes being useful and sometimes being exactly where they should not be. Visitors from nearby settlements, perhaps linked by kinship, marriage, exchange or shared ritual obligations. People grieving recent deaths. People returning to graves from previous years. People observing seasonal signs. People participating in ceremonies whose details are gone but whose material traces remain. It is important to remember that the Jōmon people were not one uniform mass. The Jōmon period lasted an enormous span of time and covered many regions, environments and communities. UNESCO describes the northern Jōmon sites as representing a sedentary hunter-fisher-gatherer society that developed in Northeast Asia from about 13,000 BCE to 400 BCE, across a set of sites showing settlements, burial areas, stone circles and ritual practices. That means Ōyu was one local expression within a much larger and longer tradition. The people who gathered there had their own local histories, choices, styles and relationships. They did not call themselves Jōmon. They had names for themselves, their rivers, their ancestors, their tools, their seasons and their stories, and those names have vanished. What remains are the things durable enough to survive. Pottery helps soften that loss a little. A pot holds traces of touch. Its surface may show decoration, smoothing, cord impressions, soot, repairs, wear, or breakage. A vessel used for cooking can carry residues of what was prepared in it. A vessel used in burial tells us that clay could become part of death ritual. A decorated bowl or vase tells us that beauty and ceremony mattered. Large urn-like vessels used to inter remains show how pottery could become part of caring for the dead. Through pottery, we see practical life and symbolic life crossing constantly. The same material that makes dinner possible can also take part in burial. Clay moves between the kitchen, the hearth, the ceremony, and the grave. There is a quiet comfort in that continuity. Human beings often use familiar materials for unfamiliar moments. We bring flowers to graves because flowers belong to ordinary life and yet can carry grief. We light candles because fire is simple and ancient. We cook for mourners because food is care made edible. We keep objects from those who have died because touch and memory cling to things. The people at Ōyu may have done these things differently, with different beliefs and materials, but the underlying human need is recognizable. The dead required attention. The living required gathering. Objects helped carry meaning when words alone were not enough. Daily life also involved ornament and identity. Jōmon sites often yield beads, pendants, lacquered items in some regions, shell ornaments, and other personal objects, though survival depends heavily on local conditions. Ornaments are not trivial. They show how people presented themselves, marked age, status, kinship, achievement, gender, group identity, or ritual role. At a gathering like Ōyu, people may have worn objects that told others where they came from, or what role they held. Clothing itself would have been made from organic materials that usually do not survive well: hides, plant fibres, bark cloth, woven or twined materials. Archaeology gives us stones and pots more readily than garments, which can make ancient people seem oddly underdressed in imagination, unless we remember the missing materials. In northern Akita, practical clothing would have mattered deeply. Cold weather is not impressed by symbolic culture. It wants insulation. Children deserve a place in the picture too. Archaeological accounts often focus on adults because adult labour and ritual are easier to infer, but children would have been everywhere in a living community. They learned by watching adults gather food, shape clay, tend fire, carry water, make tools, and behave at ceremonial places. They played, imitated, asked questions, and probably made small objects of their own. A child at Ōyu might have seen the stone circles as both special and familiar. Special because adults treated them with care, familiar because they had been there as long as the child could remember. The deep past becomes less distant when we remember that some of its witnesses were small, impatient, sleepy, hungry, and full of questions. Elders at the other end of life would have held practical memory. In non-literate societies, older people can be living archives, where certain plants grow, how seasons have changed, which families are connected, how ceremonies are done, what stories belong to which places, where old burials lie, what happened in years of scarcity, which mistakes should not be repeated. At Ōyu, knowledge of the circles, alignments, graves, and proper actions may have depended heavily on such memory. When an elder died, a library of lived knowledge could be lost unless it had been taught to others. Burial at the stone circles may therefore have marked not only the death of a person, but the transition of memory from one living body into the shared place and shared tradition. The people who gathered here were not poor versions of later farmers or incomplete versions of urban society. They were adapted to their own world. They knew how to live in a rich but demanding environment. Official Jōmon sources emphasize that northern Jōmon communities maintained sedentary lifeways based on hunting, fishing, and gathering for more than 10,000 years, adapting to environmental changes over time. That longevity should make us pause. A way of life does not endure for thousands of years because people are merely drifting. It endures because knowledge is effective, because communities can adjust, because practices make sense within their environments. Ōyu belongs to that long success. Even if it also belongs to a time of change, there were likely tensions and difficulties too. It would be misleading to make daily life too cozy simply because this is a gentle script. Winters could be hard, food could fail, illness and injury mattered. Child mortality may have been high by modern standards, accidents happened, social relationships could strain, gatherings may have involved negotiation as well as harmony. A ceremonial centre can unite people, but it can also be a place where differences have to be managed. Who has the right to bury someone where? Who leads a ceremony? Who contributes food? Who belongs to which group? Who marries whom? Who owes whom? The stones at Ōyu may have helped create order, but order is usually needed because life is not automatically orderly. That is one of the reasons the everyday and ceremonial sides of Ōyu should not be separated too sharply. A pot used at a gathering may have been made by someone whose household also needed cooking vessels. A ritual object may have been shaped by a person skilled in ordinary clay work. Food shared after a burial came from daily labour. The people standing in ceremony had also been tired, hungry, amused, irritated, proud, cold, and busy in the days before. The sacred was carried by ordinary bodies. That is true in every human society. Even the most solemn event depends on someone remembering to bring the right object, prepare the food, mend the clothing, and keep the fire going. If we could walk through a settlement connected to Ōyu, we might see pottery near hearths, tools beside work areas, stored nuts, drying fish, wood stacked for fuel, hides being worked, children learning tasks, dogs moving hopefully from one food source to another, and adults dividing labour in ways shaped by age, skill, season, and custom. We might hear laughter, instruction, argument, silence, and song. We might see someone decorating clay with cord impressions, not for us, not for a museum, but because that was how a vessel should be made. We might see someone preparing to travel to the stone circles, packing food or objects, checking what must be brought. The monument begins at home, in the tasks that make gathering possible. When people arrived at Ōyu, they carried daily life with them. Pottery carried food or ceremony. Tools prepared fires and materials. Knowledge guided movement through the site. Social roles shaped who stood where and did what. The stone circles gave the gathering a durable frame, but the people supplied the living content. Without them, Mansa and Nonokado were only stones. With them, they became a place of mourning, memory, seasonal attention, and community identity. And perhaps that is the most important thing pottery teaches us about Ōyu. A stone circle can feel distant because it is so old and so silent. A pot brings us back to the scale of the body. It fits in the hands, it rests near a fire, it breaks, it is repaired or discarded, it smells of smoke and food, it carries decoration made by fingers, cords and tools. It can be beautiful, useful, heavy, awkward, treasured or ordinary. Through pottery, the people of Ōyu become less like shadows around a monument and more like people living hour by hour inside the same world that produced the stones. Their days were shaped by food, weather, labour, skill, care and ceremony, and all of those things gathered together on the plateau. By the time we return our attention to the circles themselves, they no longer stand alone. Around them are the homes people left in the morning, the pots they shaped, the meals they prepared, the tools they carried, the elders who remembered, the children who watched, the dead who were placed in the ground, and the living who came back again. The stones remember only by remaining, but the objects around them show the motion of life. And that motion leads us toward what still remains today, not only the physical site preserved in Akita, but the questions it leaves behind, the meanings we can approach, the meanings we must admit are lost, and the quiet way ancient places continue to speak, even when their original voices have disappeared. By now, the stones at Ōyu have become more than stones. We have met them as river material carried uphill by human hands, as grave markers, as parts of two great circles, as points in a wider pattern tied to the sun, as the durable remains of ceremonies, gatherings, meals, pottery, work and memory. But after all of that, they still sit quietly in the grass. They do not explain themselves. They do not tell us the names of the people buried there. They do not tell us what songs were sung, what words were spoken, what jokes were made while heavy stones were being dragged into place, or who stood at the edge of the gathering feeling tired, hungry, proud, nervous, or ready to go home. The stones remember in the only way stones can remember. They remain. And sometimes remaining is enough to make the rest of us wonder. That is one of the strange gifts of an ancient place. It gives us evidence, but not everything. It gives us shape, but not voice. It gives us patterns, but not explanations written by the people who made them. At Ōyu, we can see that people built 2 large stone circles. We can see that the stones came from rivers. We can see that the circles were carefully arranged, that graves and ritual objects were part of the site, that the central arrangements seem connected to the summer solstice sunset, and that the place belonged to the late Jōmon world of northern Japan. These facts matter. They keep us grounded. They stop the imagination from floating away like an overconfident balloon. But facts alone do not make the place feel human. For that, we have to think about the lives behind them. The people who gathered at Ōyu did not live in order to become archaeological evidence. They were not trying to leave a neat puzzle for future researchers. They were making a place that mattered to them, in their own present, for their own dead, their own seasons, their own communities, and their own understanding of the world. That is easy to forget because we meet them from the wrong end of time. We arrive after the houses have decayed, after the fires have gone cold, after the language has disappeared, after the ceremonies have ended, after the names have been lost. We see the long result. They lived the short days. They woke in the morning, dealt with weather, hunger, work, family, illness, repair, preparation, memory, and all the small concerns that fill a life. A stone circle may be ancient to us, but to the people who made it, it was part of the ongoing business of being alive. What do the stones still remember? They remember hands, first of all. Not in a literal way, of course. A stone does not keep a thought tucked away inside itself like a secret biscuit. But the placement of each stone is a trace of touch. Someone selected it, carried it, set it down, adjusted it, perhaps looked at it from a step back, perhaps moved it again because it was not quite right. The stone's position records an action. Multiply that by thousands, and the circles become a record of shared labour. The stones remember bodies bending, lifting, pulling, walking and standing. They remember effort organised into shape. They remember that a community once considered this work important enough to do slowly and carefully. They also remember the river. Before the stones were part of Manza or Nonakado, they belonged to moving water. Their rounded forms were shaped by current, pressure and time. The river carried fish, provided water, shaped the land and supplied the material that became the circles. When those stones were taken from the river and placed on the plateau, the builders did not simply decorate a field. They moved part of the river's world into a ceremonial space. The circles therefore remember a connection between water and ground, between daily food and ritual memory, between a flowing landscape and a fixed place of return. They remind us that ancient monuments are not separate from their environments. They are made from them. The stones remember the dead too, though not by name. That may be the most serious thing about Ōyu. The circles were not just clever arrangements or scenic curiosities. They were connected with burial and ritual. People placed their dead in the ground and marked those places with stones. The dead were not pushed out of community memory. They were brought into a visible pattern where the living could return to them. A cemetery is one of the clearest signs that a society thinks beyond the immediate moment. It says that memory matters after the body is gone. It says that a person's place does not vanish entirely when they stop breathing. It says that the living have responsibilities to those who came before them. At Ōyu, those responsibilities were made durable with stone. Try to imagine one burial there, not all of them at once. One person has died. Perhaps they were old, perhaps young, perhaps expected to die, perhaps not. The community gathers. A grave is prepared, a body is carried, objects may be placed, Words may be spoken, gestures made. Some people know what to do because they have seen it before. Others are learning. Someone grieves openly. Someone stays quiet. Someone keeps the practical work moving because grief still needs hands. Stones are arranged. The grave becomes part of the larger circle. Years later, perhaps another person stands near that place and remembers. Generations later, the name may be gone, but the arrangement remains. Thousands of years later, we see only the stones, but those stones are enough to tell us that someone was cared for. That is a humbling thought. Most of us will not be remembered by name after 4,000 years. Even our most carefully organized digital folders may struggle with that kind of ambition. Passwords will be lost, devices will fail, photo libraries will become mysteries. Somewhere, a future researcher may find a file called final_final_really_final_ version 3 and understand that our civilization too had rituals of confusion. But the people at Ōyu left something more durable than a document. They left an arranged landscape. It does not tell us everything, but it tells us that memory was placed there on purpose. The stones also remember the sun. The alignment toward the summer solstice sunset gives the site a relationship with the turning year. This does not turn the whole place into a simple calendar, and it does not mean every stone had an astronomical function. But it does show that the builders watched the sky with care. They connected the circles to a point in the sun's seasonal path. They built human ceremony into the larger rhythm of light and darkness. That matters because time, for them, was not something printed on a wall calendar. It was experienced in the body and the landscape. The longest day, the return of fish, the ripening of nuts, the first hard cold, the melting of snow, the changing direction of sunset, these were not separate facts. They were how the world told people what to do next. The stones remember gatherings. They remember people arriving from nearby settlements, bringing food, tools, pottery, ritual objects, news, grief, and obligations. They remember footsteps crossing the plateau and paths formed by return. A place like Ōyu could not have mattered if people came only once and forgot it. Its meaning depended on repetition. People returned for ceremonies, burials, seasonal observances, and perhaps meetings that strengthened bonds between groups. Some may have travelled from a distance measured not in kilometres on a sign but in the feel of the route, the river crossing, the slope, the patch of forest, the bend where someone once slipped, the place where children were told to stay close. Returning to the same place gives a community continuity. It lets people say, without writing it down, we are connected because we come here. There would have been ordinary moments within those gatherings, because human beings cannot remain solemn every second, even in serious places. Someone would have been hungry. Someone would have been cold. Someone would have been asked to carry something and quietly wished a smaller object had been chosen. Someone may have laughed at the wrong moment and then tried very hard to look as if they had not. Children would have watched, copied, asked questions, forgotten instructions, and learned by being corrected. Dogs, if present, would have taken their own interest in the food supply with impressive spiritual dedication. These details may seem small, but they keep the ancient world from becoming a frozen display. The sacred and the ordinary have always lived beside each other. A ceremony can be meaningful and still require someone to tend the fire. The stones remember craft. Around the circles were pottery, clay figurines, tablets, stone rods, stone swords, tools, structures, and storage pits. These things tell us that Ōyu belonged to people who made objects with skill and intention. Pottery especially brings the Jōmon world close. Clay was dug, shaped, marked, fired, used, broken, and sometimes placed in contexts of death or ceremony. Pots cooked food and held meaning. Figurines and tablets carried symbolic forms we cannot fully translate. Stone tools shaped wood, prepared food, and supported the labour that made gatherings possible. All of these objects remind us that the people at Ōyu were not defined only by the circles. They had a whole material life, rich with touch and technique. The stones remember a way of living before rice agriculture reshaped much of Japan. The Jōmon people of northern Honshu lived by gathering, fishing, hunting, processing, storing, and managing the resources of forest and river. This was not a simple or careless existence. It required detailed knowledge. Which plants were edible, which nuts needed soaking, where fish returned, how to store food, how to make pottery that could survive heat, how to build dwellings against cold, how to move through snow, rain, mud, and summer growth. How to live well enough in one place that a major ceremonial site could be built and maintained. The circles are impressive, but they rest on the deeper achievement of daily survival done well. That daily survival was not static. The late Jōmon world was a time of change. Climate, settlement patterns, resources, and social relationships could shift. Communities may have become smaller or more dispersed in some areas, and places like Ōyu may have helped people maintain connections across that changing world. A shared ceremonial and burial place can hold a society together when ordinary life becomes more spread out. It gives people a reason to gather. It creates a common reference point. It reminds them that they belong to something wider than one household or one small settlement. In that sense, the stones remember not only stability, but adaptation. They show people responding to change by making a place of return. They also remember things we cannot recover. This may be the hardest part, but also the most honest. We do not know the names of the builders. We do not know their exact language. We do not know the full meaning of each ritual object. We do not know the songs, prayers, stories, jokes, fears, or dreams that pass through the site. We do not know whether certain stones were connected to particular families, whether certain ceremonies happened at night, whether children were frightened or excited, whether elders argued over the correct way to place a stone, or whether someone once looked at the summer solstice sunset and felt exactly the same kind of quiet awe a person might feel today. We can infer carefully, we can imagine respectfully, but we cannot possess the past completely. That incompleteness is not a problem to be solved away. It is part of what makes Ōyu powerful. The stones remind us that history is not only what can be written in full sentences, it is also what survives in traces, a stain in soil, a pit, a shard of pottery, a line of stones, a pattern of graves, a tool edge worn by use, an alignment towards sunset. These things do not speak in the way a written record speaks, but they still communicate. They ask for patience. They ask us to hold uncertainty without filling every gap with fantasy. That is not always easy. Human beings prefer clear answers. We like labels, explanations, and preferably a neat conclusion by the end of the program. Ancient places are rarely so cooperative. They offer evidence and silence together. There is a kind of respect in accepting that silence. It prevents us from turning the people of Ōyu into characters in a story we control too completely. They were real people, not props for mystery. Their lives were as full to them as ours are to us. They had knowledge we lack and limitations we do not share. They understood their landscape in ways that would probably make many modern visitors feel deeply unqualified to go for a walk without a snack and a map. They also faced hardships we are fortunate not to know. To honour them is not to pretend we understand everything. It is to look carefully at what remains and admit both what it shows and what it withholds. The preservation of Ōyu today gives the stones another layer of memory. They now belong not only to the Jōmon past, but to the modern effort to study, protect, and explain that past. Archaeologists excavate and interpret. Local communities preserve and present. Visitors walk the site, read displays, look at the circles, and try to imagine what once happened there. The site has become part of a wider recognition of Jōmon culture in northern Japan, and that recognition matters because it challenges older assumptions about what complex prehistoric life must look like. Ōyu shows that settled communities, rich ritual life, landscape architecture, and long-term memory could develop outside the usual stories of early farming states and written kings. History has more than one path. The stones remind us of that quietly, without needing to wave a flag about it. For a modern listener, especially one drifting towards sleep, the Ōyu Stone Circles may also offer a gentler lesson. They remind us that people have always needed places to gather, to remember, to mark time, and to make sense of change. Our tools are different now. We have clocks, calendars, maps, records, photographs, reminders, messages, and little devices that can tell us the weather while also making us forget why we picked them up. But the deeper needs remain familiar. We still visit graves. We still gather at seasonal times. We still cook for one another. We still keep objects because they belong to someone we loved. We still watch sunsets and feel for a moment that time has become visible. We still want our lives to leave some mark, even if only in the memory of those who knew us. Ōyu does not give us a simple answer to what was happening there 4,000 years ago. It gives us a layered one. People were building, people were burying, people were gathering, people were watching the sun, people were carrying stones from the river, people were shaping pottery, people were preparing food. People were remembering their dead. People were maintaining ties with one another. People were living inside a landscape that gave them food, materials, danger, beauty, and rhythm. And through all of that, they made a place where the ground itself became a record of community. So when we ask what the stones still remember, perhaps the answer is not one dramatic secret. Perhaps they remember the ordinary depth of human life, the weight of work, the return of seasons, the importance of the dead, the patience of craft, the comfort of gathering, the usefulness of rivers, the long watch of the sun, the need to place meaning somewhere outside the fragile body, somewhere that might last when voices do not. They remember that people stood here and cared enough to arrange the world a little differently. And now, after moving through forests, rivers, pottery, graves, firelight, solstice light, and the two great circles themselves, we arrive back in the present. Maybe you are listening late at night. Maybe the room around you is quiet. Maybe the time where you are is very different from the time in Akita, where the stones lie under their own sky, passing through another day, another evening, another season. The people who built Ōyu are gone, but the place they made continues to do what ancient places do best. It slows us down. It asks us to look carefully. It reminds us that the world was full of meaning before our own lives began, and will continue after our own moment has passed. If this quiet journey among the stones has brought you a little calm, or made the ancient earth feel closer, I'd be ever so grateful if you gave the video a like, subscribed, or shared it with someone who enjoys wandering through old places at a gentle pace. It helps this sleepy corner of curiosity reach other people who might like to rest beside stories of rivers, forests, and stones that have waited a very long time to be noticed. And wherever you are listening from tonight, whatever time it is in your small part of the world, I hope the thought of Ōyu stays with you softly. 2 circles in the grass, river stones under the open sky, and the trace of a people who gathered there 4,000 years ago, leaving behind not a written message but a place. Sleep well, fellow traveller, and let the stones keep their quiet watch.